Margaret Whitfield did not cry when Elias Carter looked at her like she was the wrong answer to a prayer. She had practiced for this moment her entire life, practiced the way a woman practices swallowing something that wants to come up. She picked up her own bag. She squared her shoulders inside that dusty blue dress. And she walked toward him across that sun-baked Colorado dirt, while half of Willow Creek watched and whispered, and some of them laughed out loud, not even bothering to hide it. She walked toward the man who was already looking for the exit. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every single comment means the world to me. Now, let's begin. The stagecoach came in 20 minutes late, which gave Elias Carter exactly 20 more minutes to regret every decision he had made in the last 6 months. He stood at the edge of the Willow Creek depot with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly between his thick fingers, the way a man does when he's trying to keep himself from walking away. The October wind off the mountains had teeth in it, already sharp and mean, the kind of cold that settled into old injuries and reminded a man of every stupid thing he'd ever done. Elias had done plenty of stupid things, but writing to the Heartland Marriage Agency in Philadelphia had felt until this exact moment like one of the smarter ones. He was 34 years old. He had calloused hands and a face that had been rearranged once by a falling pine and once by a disagreement with a man whose name he no longer remembered. He had 62 acres of mountain land, a cabin that didn't leak except in the southeast corner, and enough firewood stacked against the north wall to see him through January. He had 3 good horses, a smokehouse full of elk meat, and a reputation in Willow Creek as a man who kept his word and minded his business. What he did not have was someone to talk to. That was the part he hadn't admitted in the letter, of course. A man didn't write to a marriage agency and say the silence is eating me alive, and some mornings I stand at the window for an hour without knowing why. A man wrote practical things. He wrote that he needed a capable partner for frontier life. He wrote that he was looking for someone hard-working and sensible, someone who understood that Colorado winters were not for the faint-hearted. He had been honest about what the life would require. He had been less honest about why he needed it. The letter that came back from Philadelphia had been brief and formal, the kind of language that told him very little about the woman who would be stepping off the stage today. Margaret Whitfield, 28 years old, from a good family in Hartford, Connecticut, educated, capable in domestic matters, described by the agency as a woman of strong character and practical intelligence. Elias had read that letter 4 times. He had looked at the small portrait photograph enclosed a formal studio image, soft lighting the woman sitting very straight in a chair, and he had thought, all right, that could work. That could be a life. He had not looked closely enough at the photograph. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was standing close enough to the depot that he couldn't escape without half the town seeing him do it, because Willow Creek had turned out for this. That was the thing about small frontier towns. They ran on gossip, the way a mill ran on water, and the news that Elias Carter had sent for a mail-order bride had spread from the general store to the livery to the saloon in approximately 45 minutes. So when the stagecoach finally rolled in through the depot gate, trailing a cloud of dust, there were at least 30 people arranged along the fence line with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright entertainment. Elias recognized most of them. Tom Garrett from the hardware store. The Pendleton women, mother and daughter, who were the town's primary engine of social opinion. Deputy Horace Webb, who had no good reason to be here and was therefore clearly here for the spectacle. Old Pete Dunn, who was 80 years old and attended every public event in Willow Creek, because he had decided that witnessing things was the only hobby left available to him. They were all watching Elias, and Elias was watching the stagecoach door. The driver climbed down first, a weathered man named Connolly, whom Elias knew slightly, and began working the luggage off the top of the coach. Then the door swung open. A woman's hand appeared first gloved in cream-colored fabric that was gray with trail dust. Then a foot carefully placed on the iron step. Then Margaret Whitfield descended from the stagecoach into Willow Creek, Colorado, on the 14th of October, 1884. And every thought in Elias Carter's head went completely silent. She was not what he had expected. The portrait had shown him a face, a pleasant face, even a lovely one, but it had not prepared him for the full reality of the woman stepping onto his frontier road. Margaret Whitfield was large. Generously, unapologetically, undeniably large, a full-figured woman with broad shoulders and a substantial frame that her traveling dress, a deep blue wool with brass buttons down the front, was doing its dignified best to accommodate. She was flushed from the journey color high in her cheeks, her dark hair escaping its pins in several places. She was carrying her own traveling bag rather than waiting for the driver, and the bag was heavy. Elias could see it in the way her arm held it, but she didn't put it down. She stood in the road and looked around Willow Creek with the careful measuring expression of a woman who had been looked at all her life and had learned to look back. Then she looked at Elias. And Elias heard himself say it low and involuntary, barely above a breath, not meant for anyone's ears but his own. "That can't be my bride." It was meant to be private. It wasn't. Tom Garrett, standing 3 feet to his left, heard it clearly. So did Deputy Webb. So did Clara Pendleton, who pressed her lips together in a thin, satisfied line, the way people do when something they were hoping for turns out exactly as hoped. The whispers spread down the fence line like fire catching dry grass. Margaret Whitfield heard none of the specific words. But she had spent 28 years learning to read a crowd, and she read this one in approximately 4 seconds. She saw the way the people along the fence reacted, some looking away, some looking at her with poorly disguised amusement. She saw the way the large man with the hat in his hands went very still. She saw the way his expression, which had been carefully composed into something neutral, shifted into something he couldn't control. Surprise, discomfort. The specific look of a man who has received something other than what he ordered and is trying to decide what to do about it. Margaret had seen that look before. On her aunt's face when she was 12 years old, and her aunt had measured her for a dress and made a sound that was not quite a sigh. On the face of every young man in Hartford who had looked at her with initial interest, and then revised that interest after a fuller assessment. On the faces of the women at church and at social gatherings and at the reading society she'd attended for 2 years before she stopped being invited. She knew that look the way a woman knows a scar she's been carrying since childhood. She picked up her bag more firmly. She straightened her spine inside that dusty blue dress, and she walked toward Elias Carter. "I assume you are Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was clear and steady. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear. The voice of a woman who had decided some years ago that if she was going to say something, she was going to say it where it could be heard. Elias blinked. "Yes, ma'am. I am Margaret Whitfield." She stopped in front of him close enough to have a conversation far enough to be civil. "I apologize for the delay. The stage lost a wheel outside of Pueblo, and we had to wait for it to be repaired." Elias stared at her. She was looking at him with brown eyes that were direct and serious, and carrying something behind them that he couldn't read yet. Something layered and complicated that he would spend months trying to understand. Her face was beautiful, actually, in a way that the formal portrait had managed to flatten into something merely pleasant. A wide, expressive face, a generous mouth that was currently held in a careful, professional line. The kind of line a person holds when they're managing themselves. She was managing herself right now. He could see it. She was working very hard at calm. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mrs. Carter, if everything proceeds as arranged." A small pause. "Though I am open to discussing that if your circumstances have changed." It was a perfect sentence. Dignified. Offering him an exit if he needed one. Asking nothing from him. The kind of sentence a woman produces when she has had a great deal of practice preparing for the possibility that people might not want her. Elias was aware suddenly and uncomfortably that 30 people were watching this conversation. I was also aware that he had been staring at her for approximately 45 seconds, in a way that a man of basic decency should not stare at a woman who had just traveled 800 miles. He put his hat on. "Circumstances haven't changed," he said. "Let me take your bag." She didn't immediately release it. "I have it," she said. "I can see that. I'm offering anyway." A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Something very small, barely visible, the way a door opens 1 inch to check the weather. She handed him the bag. It was heavy. Heavier than he expected. He adjusted his grip and did not let his reaction show on his face, and he turned toward where he'd hitched the wagon. "The wagon's this way," he said. "All right," said Margaret Whitfield, and followed him. Behind them, he could hear the murmur of Willow Creek's 30 witnesses beginning to process what they had seen. He caught Clara Pendleton's voice. "Well, he certainly can't send her back now, can he?" And he kept walking. The drive out of town was quiet. Elias sat on the wagon bench and drove, and Margaret sat beside him, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving steadily over the landscape. She watched the mountains the way a person watches something that is both beautiful and potentially dangerous, with full attention, without panic. "How far is the cabin?" she asked after about a mile. "Hour and a half. Closer to 2 if the trail's still soft from last week's rain." "Is the trail likely to be soft?" "In places." "Do you have supplies for winter?" He glanced at her sideways. "Yes." "What kind of stores?" "Flour and salt mostly. Or do you have variety?" "I've got flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, smoked meat. Lard, some canned goods I brought up from town in September. Root cellars got potatoes and turnips." "Why?" "I want to understand what I'm working with," she said simply. "I brought some things from Hartford, some medicines, some seeds for spring, a few books. I didn't know what you'd have, so I tried to think about what might be lacking." Elias looked at her more directly now. "You brought medicines. My father was a physician. I assisted him for several years." She said it matter-of-factly, the way a person states a credential, not the way a person seeks credit. "I have a reasonable knowledge of treatment for common injuries and illnesses. Nothing that replaces a real doctor, but more than nothing." Elias turned back to the trail. He was quiet for a moment. "There's no doctor within 40 miles in winter," he said. "I know. The agency told me that in their materials about frontier conditions." She paused. It seemed like relevant information to have prepared for. He didn't say anything else for a while. But something had shifted slightly, some internal weight that had been sitting heavy since the stagecoach door opened, and it had moved a few degrees. Not gone. Not even close to gone. He still didn't know how this was going to work. He still couldn't see the shape of a life with this woman, this educated Hartford woman, in her blue wool dress, who had never, he would bet every cord of his firewood, spent a night below 20 degrees in her life. But she had prepared. She had thought about medicines and seeds and what might be lacking. That was something. The trail got rougher as they climbed into the foothills, the wagon jolting over roots and rocks, and Margaret held onto the bench with one hand and did not complain. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she braced herself on the rough sections, the way she studied the pine trees and the rocky outcroppings with steady, serious attention. She wasn't afraid of the landscape. She was studying it. He pulled the horses up at the creek crossing, which ran shallow at this time of year, but had a tricky bottom, loose flat stones that could shift under wheel weight. "Hold on," he said. "The crossing's uneven. It'll rock." "I've got it," she said, gripping the bench with both hands. He took the horses through, slowly feeling the wheels find purchase on the stones, and the wagon tilted left for a lurching moment before leveling out on the far bank. Margaret exhaled once, sharp and controlled, but she held. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine." She glanced down at the creek. "The current's stronger than it looks." "Always is up here." "I'll remember that." 3 words. Not a complaint. Not a reassurance seeking praise. Just an acknowledgement. "I'll remember that." Elias filed it away somewhere without fully knowing why. 2 miles from the cabin, the left rear wheel found soft ground at the edge of the trail and sank 6 inches with a sound that Elias had heard before and never liked. He pulled the horses up and climbed down to look. The wheel was buried to the hub on the left side, the ground gone soft over what was probably an underground spring running close to the surface. He straightened up, pulling the options in his head. He'd need to cut brush to put under the wheel for traction. He had a hand axe behind the seat. He'd need to rock the wagon while the horses pulled, which meant he'd need to, the left wheel's sinking because the ground over there is waterlogged. Margaret's voice from the wagon bench. "There's an underground spring running under the trail. You can see where the grass changes color. It's darker and flattened there and there again about 10 feet ahead." Elias turned and looked where she was pointing. She was right. If you put brush under the wheel for traction, and I take the reins while you push from the back left corner," she continued, "the horses should be able to pull it free without losing the wheel entirely." He stared at her. "How would you know that?" he asked. "The horses are pulling unevenly," she said. "The right team is working harder because the left side has less resistance. And I've watched wagon extractions before. My father used to make house calls on country roads that weren't much better than this." Elias looked at the wheel, looked at the trail, looked at her. "Can you handle the reins while I push?" "Yes." He got the axe and cut brush and packed it under the wheel, while Margaret climbed carefully down from the bench and took the reins. She spoke to the horses quietly, steadily, the way a person speaks when they know that animals respond to tone more than volume. "Easy," she said. "Easy now." Elias positioned himself at the back left corner of the wagon, set his boots against a stone for purchase, and nodded. "When I say go," he called. "Ready," she said. "Go." She clicked the horses forward. Elias pushed with everything he had, his shoulder against the wagon frame, his boots sliding and then catching, his whole body driving against the weight of the stuck wheel. The brush held, the wheel turned, the wagon lurched forward and free, and Margaret kept the horses moving until all four wheels were on solid ground, then drew them to a stop, smooth and clean. Elias walked up alongside the wagon, breathing hard. He looked at Margaret Whitfield, sitting on the bench with the reins loose in her hands, and for the first time since the stagecoach door had opened, he looked at her without the noise of his own assumptions filling up the space between them. "Good," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression asked whether he meant the horses or her. He meant her. He didn't say it yet, but he meant it. The cabin appeared around the last bend in the trail in the early afternoon, the log walls dark with age, the stone chimney, solid and straight, smoke from this morning's fire still trailing thin from the top. The woodpile against the north wall was substantial. Elias had spent the better part of September building it, and the root cellar door was visible near the south corner, set into a low earthen mound. It was not a beautiful home. It was not a comfortable home by any measure a Hartford woman might use. It was a working man's frontier cabin at the edge of survivable wilderness, and it looked exactly like what it was. Margaret sat on the wagon bench and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Elias watched her look at it. He waited for the expression, the disappointment, the reevaluation, the beginning of the withdrawal that he suspected had been building since the stagecoach, since the moment she read his face on that depot road. Instead, Margaret said, "The chimney draws well." He blinked. "What?" "The smoke from the chimney." She nodded toward it. "It's pulling straight up in a light wind. That means the draw is good and the cabin will heat well. That matters up here." A pause. "The woodpile is bigger than I expected. You've been working hard." He had no response ready for that. He climbed down from the wagon, and she climbed down after him, and he carried her bags inside while she walked around the exterior of the cabin, first examining the walls for gaps, checking the condition of the shutters, looking at the root cellar door with the focused attention of a woman taking inventory. Inside, the cabin was clean but spare. One main room with the fireplace on the west wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, shelves stocked with provisions, a separate small sleeping room through a low door. He had added a second bed, a simple frame with a straw mattress, and he had separated the room with a hanging curtain for privacy. He set her bags by the door and stood with his hands at his sides. "I added a curtain," he said, "for privacy. It's not—" He stopped. "It's not much." Margaret stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, taking it all in. He watched her face. She was doing that thing again, the thorough, systematic inventory of someone calculating what they are actually working with. Then she said, "Where do you keep your extra blankets?" He pointed to the cedar chest under the window. "And your medical supplies, what do you have?" "A tin box, under the kitchen shelf. Mostly bandages and carbolic acid." She nodded. "I'll need to organize the space differently. The kitchen area would work better if the heaviest stores were lower, and the dry goods were elevated moisture from cooking rises, and will ruin flour if the sacks are on the upper shelf." "All right." "Also, the east shutter has a gap at the bottom right corner. I saw it when I walked around. You'll want to pack that before the first hard snow, or you'll lose heat through the night." Elias stared at her. "You walked around the cabin and spotted a gap in the shutter." "I was looking," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll fix it tomorrow. I can help if you show me how the shutters are attached." He didn't know what to say to that. He'd never in his adult life had anyone offer to help him fix a shutter. He lived alone. Help had not been a word in his working vocabulary for longer than he cared to examine. "We'll see," he said. He built up the fire while Margaret began, without being asked, to reorganize the kitchen shelving. She didn't make a production of it. She simply moved things with quiet efficiency, checking everything as she went, occasionally asking where something came from or how often he used it. "You've got wild sage up here," she said at one point. "Yeah. There's a stand of it about a quarter-mile east." "Good. Sage tea helps with fever, and it's useful as a disinfectant rinse in a pinch. I'll want to gather some and dry it before the serious cold comes." "You know plant medicines?" "Some. My father believed in using what the landscape offered when pharmacy wasn't available." She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "It's a practical philosophy out here, I'd think." "It is," Elias said. How was watching her move around his kitchen, efficient and thoughtful, not delicate, not performing anything, and something in his chest was doing a slow, uncomfortable rearrangement. The kind of rearrangement a man feels when he has been wrong about something in a way that cannot be fully catalogued yet. He had looked at Margaret Whitfield on that depot road and made a complete and total assessment of her value. And he had been wrong, not about everything. He still didn't know how she would manage a full Colorado winter, still didn't know if the isolation would break her, still didn't know if there was any possible world in which the two of them could build something real up here on this mountain. But he had been wrong about her being fragile. He had been wrong about her being unprepared. And something in him knew already that there was more he was wrong about, more he hadn't seen yet, because he'd stopped looking. That evening, they sat at the rough table and ate a simple meal that Margaret had assembled from his stores, a soup that was considerably better than anything he cooked for himself, with herbs he hadn't identified, and a thickness that suggested she'd found the right proportions without being told. They didn't talk much, but the silence was different from the silence he lived in alone. He couldn't entirely explain the difference. It was still quiet. The mountain was still dark outside the window, and the wind had picked up after sunset, and the fire was doing the steady work of keeping the cold at bay. But the silence had company in it. He hadn't felt that in a long time. After dinner, Margaret excused herself to the sleeping room with a candle, and Elias sat by the fire for a while, turning his hat brim in his hands the way he had at the depot, except that now he was turning it because he was thinking instead of because he was dreading. He thought about what she'd said at the wagon. The left wheel's sinking because the ground is waterlogged. He thought about the shutter gap she'd spotted on her first walk around the cabin. I thought about sage tea and plant medicines and the way she had spoken to the horses easy now, like she already knew them. He thought about the photograph he had looked at 4 times, and the letter he had carried to the depot in his breast pocket, and the moment the stagecoach door opened and his stomach had dropped. He thought about the sentence she had offered him in the road. "I am open to discussing that if your circumstances have changed." She had given him an exit, standing in front of 30 witnesses who wanted to see him falter, travel-worn and flushed, and carrying her own bags. She had held herself together and given him a graceful exit with 1 sentence. And she'd done it for his benefit, not for hers. He sat with that for a long time. In the sleeping room behind the curtain, Margaret Whitfield lay on the straw mattress under 2 blankets and stared at the log ceiling of Elias Carter's cabin, and thought about Hartford, Connecticut in October, which was beautiful and terrible, and nothing she missed. Not really, though. She missed the idea of belonging somewhere, the way you miss a thing you never fully had. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with her aunt before she left. Her aunt had sat across the parlor table with her hands folded and her expression arranged into the particular combination of pity and practicality that Margaret had been receiving from her aunt since she was 8 years old. "You understand," her aunt had said, "that this is essentially your last reasonable option." Margaret had said yes, she understood. "A man in the mountains, a rough sort of life, you may find it very difficult. Physically, I mean." Margaret had said she was aware. Your size. Her aunt had paused with the delicacy of someone navigating something genuinely hazardous. Men in those situations need practical women, strong women. I just want to be certain you understand what he's expecting. Margaret had looked at her aunt and said very calmly, I'm stronger than you think I am. Her aunt had smiled the smile of someone who loves a person and does not believe them. Margaret stared at the cabin ceiling and listened to the wind working itself against the walls. She thought about the look on Elias Carter's face when she stepped off that stagecoach. She'd seen it clearly. She hadn't flinched, but she'd seen it. That can't be my bride. She had heard those words too, underneath the whispers carried toward her on the wind, the way bad news always finds its way to the person it concerns. She had heard them, and she had picked up her bag, and she had walked toward him anyway. Because what was the alternative? Get back on the stage. Go back to Hartford where she was tolerated, but not wanted. Loved in the way people love a problem they've grown accustomed to. She had burned that road deliberately when she'd boarded the eastbound stage 6 weeks ago. She had sold the few possessions she owned outright, packed everything that would fit into one traveling bag, and stepped forward into the only life that had offered her something that felt like a door. She was going to make this door open. She was going to make herself indispensable to this mountain and this man who had looked at her like a mistake, and she was going to do it, not out of desperation, but out of the solid, quiet fury of a woman who has spent 28 years being underestimated and has finally decided to let that fuel something. She pulled the second blanket up around her shoulders. Outside, the wind pushed at the cabin with the first real edge of winter in it. Inside, the fire Elias had built was doing its job, and the walls were solid, and the chimney drew clean, and the shutter in the east corner had that gap. She'd noticed the one she'd mentioned, the one he'd said he'd fix. He'd said he'd fix it. That was something. Margaret Whitfield closed her eyes. She did not sleep immediately. But when she finally did sleep, it was the sleep of a woman who has made a decision and means to honor it, the deep and settled kind that comes not from comfort, but from having finally at last chosen a direction and placed her feet upon the road. 2 weeks passed on that mountain, and they were hard weeks, the kind that tested a person's actual substance rather than the imagined kind. The first week was cold and demanding. Elias was up before dawn every day, tending the horses and hauling water and splitting more wood, and he expected Margaret to find a pace she could manage and settle into it. Instead, she was up before him, not trying to outwork him. She wasn't foolish enough to attempt that, and he was glad she wasn't, because pride-driven exhaustion was dangerous up here. But she had established her own rhythm, fast and efficient and thorough routine that covered the cabin's domestic requirements in a way that freed Elias's full time for the outdoor work, and she did it without complaint and without requiring instruction twice. He showed her the wood stove's particular temperament once. She never asked again. He showed her where the water from the creek came clearest once. She never asked again. She learned by watching, which was something, and she learned fast, which was something more. But the nights were the strangest part. After dinner, when the fire was banked and the work was done, they would sit at the rough table sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2, and they would talk. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected the talking. Margaret asked him about the mountains, the trails, the winter patterns, the wildlife, the history of how he'd come to this particular 62 acres. She asked with genuine interest, not the polite conversation interest a person performs when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind, the listening kind. And he told her. He told her about the first winter he'd spent up here when he was 22, and green and nearly died from an infected foot because he hadn't known enough to clean a wound properly. He told her about the elk migration patterns and where the water ran clean and where it ran suspicious, and how to read the mountain weather in the shape of the clouds rather than the temperature of the air. She listened to all of it. And then she told him things in return. About Hartford. About growing up in a house where her father was beloved and her mother had died young, and she had been large since childhood, and had learned early that the world has a particular relationship to girls who take up more physical space than it expects. She said it plainly. Not bitterly, or not only bitterly, but clearly the way someone speaks about a fact they have finished being surprised by. People see what they expect to see, she said one night. her hands wrapped around a tin cup of the sage tea she'd gathered and dried. I learned that very young. They look at me, and they see certain things, and those things crowd out everything else. It took me a long time to stop trying to change what they see and start not caring about it. "Do you not care about it?" Elias asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on not caring about it," she said. "That's more honest." He looked at her across the table. He thought about the depot, about the 30 witnesses and the whispers and his own involuntary words that "can't be my bride" carried toward her on a Colorado wind. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "What I said." He stopped, tried again. "At the depot, when you stepped off the stage. You don't need to." "I do," he said. "I said something I'm not proud of, and you heard it." She was quiet. Her hands around the cup went very still. "I was wrong," Elias said, "about what I thought when I saw you. I made a judgment based on I made a wrong judgment. And I'm telling you now because you deserve to hear it said plainly." Margaret looked at the fire for a long moment. When she looked back at him, her expression was careful and complicated, the way expressions get when a person is receiving something they wanted and are not quite sure they trust. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it. I mean it, I know." A pause. People rarely say things like that unless they mean them. It's too uncomfortable to bother with otherwise. Elias nodded. They sat in the firelit silence for a while. Then Margaret said, "I knew the life would be hard. I came prepared for hard. What I didn't know was whether you were the kind of man who could be honest." And now, she met his eyes. "Now I know you're at least honest enough to admit when you've been wrong." A small pause. "That's more than most men manage." Elias looked at her, this woman in his firelight, with her plain frontier dress and her sage tea and her direct brown eyes that missed nothing. He thought about the shutter gap she'd spotted the first hour, the spring-softened ground she'd identified by watching the horses, the soup that was better than anything he'd cooked himself in a decade, the medicines she'd brought from Hartford, the way she'd spoken to his horses easy now, as if they were people worth being kind to. He thought about a woman who had been told her whole life what she was incapable of and who had quietly, systematically prepared herself for every specific hardship of the life she was walking into anyway. "You brought seeds," he said. She looked at him, slightly puzzled by the shift. "For spring, yes." "What kind?" "Beans mostly, some squash, wild onion, a variety of medicinal herbs. I found a catalog and wrote away for them in July when I was confirmed for the placement." She paused. "I thought about what a mountain garden would need. The growing season is short up here." "It is." "I found some writing about altitude gardening at the Hartford Library. I know it'll be difficult the first year. The soil will need work, and I don't know all its particularities yet. But I wanted to be ready." The Hartford Library. This woman had gone to the Hartford Library and found writing about altitude gardening in the Colorado mountains because she was going to be ready. Elias Carter sat in his firelight and felt something in his chest do another one of those slow, uncomfortable rearrangements. "All right," he said. "All right. You should look at the south-facing slope below the cabin." He kept his voice even. "The soil's better there. Deeper, less rocky. Less frost shadow in the early morning. If you want to start a kitchen garden in spring, that's where I'd put it." Margaret looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket and wrote something in it. He didn't ask what she wrote, but he thought about it later after she'd gone to bed, and he was banking the fire for the night. He thought she had probably written south-facing slope. Just those 3 words. Filed away. Ready to use when spring came. This woman, he was beginning to understand, was not surviving this mountain. She was making plans for it. The 3rd week on the mountain was when Willow Creek came to them. Elias heard the horses first, the way they shifted and stamped in the small corral when something unfamiliar moved up the trail, and he was at the cabin door before the wagon cleared the last bend. He recognized the rig immediately. Tom Garrett's flatbed, the one with the mismatched wheel that Tom had been meaning to replace since spring. And beside Tom on the bench sat Clara Pendleton, which told Elias everything he needed to know about the purpose of this visit before a single word was spoken. Clara Pendleton did not make social calls to mountain cabins. Clara Pendleton made inspections. Elias, Tom said, pulling up the horses. He had the slightly guilty expression of a man who had been talked into something he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but lacked the will to refuse. Brought Mrs. Pendleton up. She wanted to well. He looked at Clara. I wanted to see how your wife is settling in, Clara said. She was a small, thin woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and a manner so precisely calibrated to social authority that she wielded it the way other people wielded money. It's been 3 weeks. Naturally, we're all curious. Naturally, Elias said. He did not move from the doorway. Inside behind him, he heard Margaret set something down on the kitchen shelf. A quiet sound, deliberate. She had heard the wagon. Are you going to invite us in? Clara asked. That depends on whether you're here as neighbors or as something else, Elias said. Clara blinked. People did not speak to her this way in Willow Creek. I beg your pardon. At the depot, Elias said. He kept his voice even. 3 weeks ago, you had something to say about my wife. Tom Garrett looked at the horses. Clara's chin came up. I was merely commenting on the situation, which was somewhat unexpected for everyone, I think you'll agree. I don't agree, Elias said. And I think my wife heard you. A silence. Then Margaret's voice came from inside the cabin. Elias. Calm. Clear. Let them in. It's cold. He held for a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the door. Clara Pendleton swept inside with the manner of a woman taking possession of a room, and then she stopped. The cabin was transformed. Not in the way of luxury, it was still a working frontier cabin with rough walls and a plank floor. But there was an order to it now, a careful and specific order that showed in everything from the arrangement of the kitchen stores to the dried herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beam above the fireplace to the mended curtains on the window that Elias was fairly certain had been torn when he'd last paid attention to them. Margaret stood at the kitchen shelf with a composure that Elias recognized by now. The managed kind. The kind that lived just beneath the surface and cost something to maintain. Mrs. Pendleton, she said. Mr. Garrett, please sit down. Tom sat immediately. Clara moved to the table with the slow deliberateness of a woman assessing a battlefield. You've made changes, Clara said, looking around. I've organized things, Margaret said. Mr. Carter's stores were well stocked. They just needed rearranging. Those are herb bundles. Sage yarrow and wild thyme. There's a good stand of each within a quarter mile. Useful medicinally and for cooking. Margaret set tin cups on the table with the ease of a woman who had been keeping house her whole life. I've been learning the landscape. Clara looked at her with an expression that was recalculating something. You gathered those yourself? I did. On the mountain? Yes. In the 3 weeks you've been here? It doesn't take long once you know what you're looking for, Margaret said. My father taught me. He believed in using what's available locally. She poured water from the kettle into the cups. Tea. Clara Pendleton sat down at Elias Carter's rough kitchen table and accepted tea from the woman she had whispered about at the depot, and something in the room shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but Elias felt it the way you feel a change in wind direction. The cabin is warmer than I expected, Clara said finally. Elias fixed the east shutter gap, Margaret said. The heat was escaping through the night. We packed it with rope caulk and it's held well. We packed it. Elias had fixed it. Margaret had held the rope caulk and told him when the line was running even. But she said we, and the words settled into the cabin like something that belonged there. Tom Garrett looked up from his tea with an expression of mild surprise. Clara Pendleton studied Margaret with her sharp eyes for a long moment. You look well, she said finally. It seemed to cost her something. I feel well, Margaret said. The mountain suits me. I wasn't certain it would, but it does. The winters are very hard. So I've been told. Margaret met Clara's gaze directly. I intend to be ready for it. Clara looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. Clara looked back at Margaret. We have a sewing circle on the first Thursday of each month, Clara said. In town, at my house, if you wanted to attend when the trail permits. Margaret nodded once. That's very kind. I'll think on it. Not yes, not no. Think on it. The response of a woman who has learned that offered inclusion can be withdrawn and who does not intend to position herself to need anything from Willow Creek's social machinery. Elias recognized the calculation behind it. He was beginning to recognize most of her calculations. That evening after the wagon had descended the trail and the mountain was theirs again, Elias sat down at the table with the particular heaviness of a man who has had company he didn't want and is glad it's gone. She came to see if you'd failed, he said. Margaret set the cups in the wash basin without turning around. I know. Clara Pendleton decides things in that town. What she says about people sticks. I know that too. She's going to go back and tell them about the herb bundles and the reorganized kitchen and the shutter gap. Yes. Margaret did turn around now. And what she tells them will be true. So I don't particularly mind what she tells them. Elias looked at her. You handled her well, he said. I've been handling women like Clara Pendleton since I was 12 years old. Not bitterly, just plainly the way she said most things. They're not complicated once you understand that their primary concern is whether you're going to upset the social order. If you demonstrate that you're competent and quiet and not asking for anything they'd rather keep for themselves, they generally adjust. And if they don't adjust, Margaret looked at him steadily. Then they don't. I've survived people not adjusting before. I expect I'll manage. Elias nodded. He thought about the depot again. The way she'd walked toward him with 30 people watching and her chin up. She had been walking toward hostile territory her entire life. He was beginning to understand that the mountain was not the hardest thing Margaret Whitfield had ever faced. November arrived the way. November arrived in the Colorado high country, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a door being kicked open. The first serious snowfall came on a Tuesday, and it did not stop for 3 days. Elias was not worried about the snow itself. He had seen worse. He had the wood, the stores, the horses in the corral shelter, and the cabin was sound. Winter was not the enemy up here, unpreparedness was the enemy, and Elias had been preparing for this winter since August. What he had not prepared for was Margaret, not in the way he'd expected to not be prepared for her, not the fragility, not the inability to cope. Those expectations had dissolved weeks ago, and he was finished being surprised by her capability. What he had not prepared for was how Margaret functioned during 3 days of confinement with a man she'd known for less than a month. She did not go quiet. She did not withdraw. Not. She filled the 3 days with focused industry that managed to be both completely unobtrusive and absolutely constant. She reorganized the medical supplies in a system she explained to him carefully and then wrote down in her notebook. She split the dried medicinal herbs into labeled canvas pouches. She mended every piece of worn fabric in the cabin, his shirts, the curtains, a hole in the blanket he used for the horses that he'd been intending to patch since July. And she talked, not constantly. She was not a woman who talked to fill silence, he'd established that early. But in the evenings when the storm was at the window and the fire was the center of the world, she talked in the way that people talk when they are actually saying things, and he found himself answering in kind, which was something he had not done in a very long time. On the second evening of the storm, she asked him about his family. He was quiet for a moment. My mother died when I was 16, he said. Fever. My father, he was a hard man. Not cruel, but hard. He believed you survived by not needing much. He taught me that. What happened to him? He went back east when I was 22. Couldn't take the winters anymore. We wrote for a few years. Then we stopped writing. He turned his cup in his hands. I don't know if he's still living. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. It's still something to carry. She paused. My mother died when I was 9. Fever also. My father was different from yours, I think. Not hard, but lost after she died. He poured himself into his work, and I think that's how he survived it. A pause. He was a good man. He died 4 years ago. I miss him still. What happened to you after he died? I went to live with my aunt. The words were careful, the way words are careful when they are covering something larger. She was his sister. She took me in because it was the right thing to do, and she fulfilled that obligation conscientiously. A pause. Conscientiously is the right word. There was nothing wrong with the way she treated me. It was just obligation rather than wanting. Elias looked at her across the fire. That's a hard thing to live inside, he said. Yes. She met his eyes. It's why I wrote to the agency. Not because I was desperate, whatever people might assume. I wrote because I wanted something that was chosen rather than obligated. I wanted to be somewhere someone had asked for me to be. She stopped. Even if the asking was imprecise. A small, careful pause. Even if I wasn't quite what was asked for. The depot again. That can't be my bride. He'd apologized for the words. He hadn't apologized for what drove them, the assumption, the assessment, the completeness of his initial dismissal. Margaret, he said, you don't need to say anything else about it. I'm going to anyway. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. I looked at you in that road, and I made a judgment that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with what I thought I needed, what I thought strength looked like. He stopped. I was wrong about what strength looks like. She was very still. You've shown me that every day since you got here, he said. The wheel in the mud, the shutter gap, the herbs, the way you handled Clara Pendleton. He shook his head slightly. You came to this mountain knowing nobody and knowing nothing about it, and you've been learning it the same way you learn everything, deliberately and completely. And I've been watching that happen, and I've been... He stopped again. What? She asked. Her voice was very quiet. I've been grateful, Elias said. That you came, that you stayed, that you're here. The storm pushed at the cabin walls. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You're a better man than you think you are. I don't know about that. I do, she said simply. I've had enough experience with men who aren't to know the difference. They sat in the stormlight for a while, the fire between them, neither of them pushing toward the thing that was beginning to exist in the room, because they were both careful people. People who had been hurt by moving too fast toward things that looked like what they needed, and they knew without saying it that this had to be grown slowly if it was going to be real. But it was there. It was beginning to be there. The storm broke on the fourth morning, and Elias went out to check the horses, and found that the corral shelter's east wall had taken a hit from a fallen branch. Not catastrophic, but the boards were cracked and the horses were cold, and it needed immediate repair. He was carrying boards from the woodpile to the corral when Margaret appeared beside him. She had his extra coat on over her dress, the old brown one he'd hung by the door, and her hair was braided back, and she was carrying the toolbox. Where do you need me? She said. Elias looked at the toolbox. You don't need to. Where do you need me? She said again. He pointed to the cracked boards. Hold those in place while I nail them. The cold makes the wood brittle, and it'll shift if I try to hold and nail at once. She positioned herself at the boards without another word, and held them firm while he worked her hands steady against the cracked timber, her weight against the wall keeping everything in place. The cold was deep and mean, and her breath came in quick white clouds, but she held her position without complaint until the last nail was in. Good, Elias said. She stepped back and looked at the repair critically. The middle board is still slightly bowed. It'll hold through this winter, but you might want to replace it come spring. He looked at the middle board. She was right. I'll note it, he said. She handed him back the toolbox. Her hands were red with cold through the thin gloves she'd been wearing, and he caught that, noticed it, before she pulled her hands back. Your gloves aren't heavy enough for this, he said. They're what I have. I have a spare pair, wool-lined. They'll be big, but they'll keep your hands. He paused. I'll get them for you. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. Such a small thing. Gloves. But the way she said thank you, the way she received it, not deflecting, not minimizing, not saying, oh, it's fine, I'll manage, that was its own thing. A woman accustomed to not being given things learning to receive them. He got the gloves. December came on fast and merciless, and with it came the first real test of the mountain. Not weather they'd been handling. What came in December was a man named Roy Ballard who rode up the trail on a gray horse with a rifle across his saddle, and a claim that part of Elias's 62 acres had been improperly surveyed and in fact belonged to him by right of an older land grant. Elias knew Roy Ballard. Knew him the way mountain men know the particular kind of man who circulates through frontier territories, finding leverage wherever it can be found. Not an outright criminal, but not an honest man either. The kind who studied weakness and moved toward it. Roy Ballard had ridden up this trail because he'd heard that Elias Carter had taken a wife he hadn't wanted, and Roy Ballard had decided that a man distracted by a domestic disappointment might be a man whose property lines were worth questioning. He pulled up at the cabin door and delivered his claim with the careful language of a man who had practiced it. Elias stood at the door and listened. And then Margaret stepped out from behind him. Roy Ballard looked at her. His expression organized itself into something that was almost a smirk. "This the wife," he said to Elias, not looking away from Margaret. "This is Mrs. Carter," Elias said. His voice had gone very flat. "Heard about you," Roy said to Margaret. "Heard Carter here wasn't too happy with what showed up on that stage." He adjusted the rifle across his saddle with a casual ease that was meant to be noticed. "Must be an interesting situation. Man up here alone with a woman he didn't really choose." "Mr. Ballard," Margaret said. He looked at her with mild surprise that she'd used his name. "My husband and I have a copy of the original survey completed in 1879 by the Territorial Land Office," she said. Her voice was completely level. "I found it in the land documents when I was organizing Mr. Carter's papers 3 weeks ago. I also noted that the survey markers on the eastern boundary, which is the boundary you appear to be questioning, were reset in 1881, and their positions are recorded in a secondary document filed with the county registrar in Pueblo." A pause. "Do you have documentation for the land grant you're claiming?" Roy Ballard stared at her. "Because if you do," Margaret continued, "I'd be interested to see it dated before 1879. If it predates the territorial survey, it would be worth bringing to the county registrar's attention. If it doesn't predate it—" She paused again. "Then I'd think carefully about what you're actually here for." Elias did not move. He was watching Roy Ballard's face go through several expressions in quick succession, like a hand of cards being reorganized. "I'll be checking the county records," Roy said finally. "You should," Margaret said. "The registrar's office in Pueblo is open on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I believe the ride from your place is about 4 hours." A perfectly calibrated pause. "Safe travels, Mr. Ballard." Roy Ballard turned his gray horse and rode down the trail without another word. Elias waited until the hoofbeats faded. Then he said, "You read the land documents." "I read everything I could find when I organized the papers," Margaret said. "I thought it was important to understand what we own and what could threaten it." She glanced at him. "Roy Ballard has made similar claims against 2 other mountain properties in the last 4 years. I heard about it from Tom Garrett when he was here with Clara. Neither family had their documentation in order. Ballard got partial settlements from both." Elias stared at her. "You knew about Ballard." "I knew about the pattern. I didn't know if he'd come here." She looked down the trail where the gray horse had disappeared. "I thought he might. When a man senses a household is unsettled, he tends to move toward it." "A household is unsettled." She meant them the particular awkwardness of what they'd been, what they were becoming, the not quite known shape of their life together. She had assessed that as a vulnerability and prepared for it. "Margaret," Elias said. She looked at him. "Where did you find the 1881 survey record?" "In the bottom of the cedar chest, under the extra blankets, folded in a piece of oilcloth." She paused. "You really should keep your legal documents somewhere more systematic." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened that had not happened on this mountain in a very long time. He laughed. Not a polite sound, not a managed expression, a real laugh surprised out of him, rough and unpracticed from disuse. Margaret blinked. Then slowly, the careful line of her mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile yet, but was on its way to becoming one. "I'll build you a document box," Elias said, "with a proper latch." "I'd appreciate that," she said. They went back inside, and the mountain was quiet, and the trail was empty, and Roy Ballard did not come back. Christmas came with a clarity that mountain winters sometimes produce between storms, a day of cold, brilliant, absolute stillness, when the world looked like something that had been made very carefully and placed very deliberately and was asking to be noticed. Elias had not celebrated Christmas in years, not since he didn't track the last one specifically. It had faded into the general silence of years lived alone. But Margaret had asked him in early December, with the straightforward matter-of-factness that was her particular approach to everything, whether he had any tradition about the day. He'd said no. She'd said, "Do you mind if I make one?" He'd said he didn't mind. What she made was a meal that took most of the day. Something elaborate with the dried herbs and a rabbit he'd caught 2 days before, and the last of the root vegetables from the cellar. A soup that became something considerably more than the sum of its parts. She had also, he discovered, brought a small quantity of spiced tea, packed carefully at the bottom of her traveling bag, kept for exactly this occasion. They sat at the table that evening with the good meal between them, and the spiced tea and the fire, and she had put pine boughs on the windowsill. He had seen her collect them that morning without asking why. And the cabin smelled like Christmas, in a way that made something move in Elias's chest that he wasn't prepared for. "My father made spiced tea every Christmas," Margaret said. "It's the smell I remember most, not the tree or the decorations, the tea." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I used to sit at his feet by the fireplace while he read aloud, every Christmas night for as long as I can remember." What did he read? Different things. He had wide tastes. She smiled a real smile, unguarded the first time Elias had seen her smile without the management behind it. He read Dickens, of course. Everyone reads Dickens at Christmas. But he also read adventure stories sometimes, and natural history. And once, when I was very small, he read me an account of a man who had traveled through these mountains through Colorado, and wrote about what he saw. She paused. I don't think I remembered that until now. I think I had forgotten it entirely. What did the man write about? Margaret looked into her tea. He wrote that the mountains were indifferent to human plans. That they didn't care what you brought with you or what you intended. That the only thing the mountain asked was whether you were willing to be changed by it. A pause. "I think I'm being changed by it." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Is that all right?" he asked. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "I think it might be the best thing that's happened to me." He looked at her in the Christmas firelight. This woman who had been an unwanted answer to a practical letter, who had arrived in a blue traveling dress covered in trail dust, and walked toward a man who was looking for the exit, who had reorganized his kitchen and fixed his shutter gap, and faced down Roy Ballard, with survey documentation she'd found in the bottom of a cedar chest, and felt something he recognized from very long ago, from before the silence had become his primary companion. He felt like he was not alone. "Margaret," he said. "Yes." He looked at his cup, looked at the pine boughs on the windowsill, looked back at her. "I'm glad you didn't go back on the stage," he said. She held very still for a moment. "So am I," she said. The fire worked steadily in the silence between them, and outside the Christmas night was cold and brilliant and completely still. January was when everything nearly fell apart. It started with the weather, the way most things did up here. A storm system that came in from the northwest, with a ferocity that even Elias, who had wintered on this mountain for 12 years, found formidable. The temperature dropped to levels that made movement outside genuinely dangerous. The horses needed tending twice daily regardless, and Elias handled that himself, refusing to let Margaret come out into cold that could kill in 20 minutes if something went wrong. But the cold found its way inside anyway. By the 4th day of the deep freeze, Margaret had a cough. She didn't tell him. She was very good at not telling him things she thought would worry him unnecessarily. He'd noticed that about her, the way she managed her own difficulties quietly, and brought him problems only when they'd crossed the line from manageable to requiring assistance. He found out because he heard her at 2 in the morning, heard her trying to suppress the cough behind the curtain and not entirely succeeding. He knocked on the curtain frame. "I'm all right," she said immediately. I know. I'm coming in anyway. A pause. Elias. Margaret. Silence. Then, all right. He came through the curtain with a candle and found her sitting up in the bed, wrapped in both blankets, her face flushed and her eyes carrying the particular bright quality that comes with fever. How long, he asked. Since yesterday morning. She held up a hand before he could say anything. It's not serious. Ivy assessed it. It's a chest cold responding to the cold air. I'm running a mild fever, not high enough to be dangerous yet. The cough is productive, which means my lungs are clearing themselves. I need warmth and fluids and sleep. You need warmth and fluids and sleep, and to have told me this yesterday morning, Elias said. I didn't want to. She stopped. To what? She looked at him from inside her blanket, wrapping, flushed and bright-eyed, and very briefly, unguardedly young-looking, in a way she wasn't usually. I didn't want to be a burden, she said. The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. Elias set the candle on the shelf and sat down on the edge of the bed frame. You told me, he said carefully, the night of the first storm that you came west because you wanted to be somewhere you'd been asked for, not just tolerated. She watched him. I asked for you, he said. You're not a burden. You're Margaret. You've been running this cabin since the day you arrived. You took on Roy Ballard with survey documentation. You saw the shutter gap in the first hour. He stopped. If you are sick, you tell me. That's what... He stopped again. That's what she asked. Very quiet. That's what it means to not be alone, he said. That's the whole of it. Someone to tell when something's wrong. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The fever bright in her eyes might have been the candlelight, but he didn't think it was entirely the candlelight. All right, she said. I'm telling you now. I have a chest cold and a mild fever, and I need the following things. She ticked them off on her fingers with the precise efficiency he'd come to recognize as her primary emotional language. Competence as steadiness, when steadiness was hardest. Strong sage tea with honey if we have it. An extra blanket from the cedar chest. And the camphor oil that's in the medical tin rubbed on my chest. It will help the cough by morning. We have honey, Elias said. I'll get the tin. The camphor oil is in the left corner of the tin in the blue glass bottle. I know where it is, he said. You organized it and explained the system to me. Something in her expression shifted. So I did, she said. I mawed the tea and found the camphor oil and sat on the floor outside the curtain while she applied it, and when she called him back in, he arranged the extra blanket around her shoulders, and she sat propped against the wall, looking slightly less flushed and slightly more herself. You should sleep, she said. In a while. Elias, you have to be up at 5 to tend the horses. The cold is still serious out there. I'll be up at 5. She studied him. You're staying up to watch the fever, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm staying up to keep the fire, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fever won't spike, she said. I've had this type of cold before. By morning the worst will be past. Probably, he agreed. But you're staying anyway. Somebody has to keep the fire. Margaret Whitfield looked at Elias Carter sitting beside her bed on a January night in a Colorado mountain cabin, while a storm pressed its full weight against the walls, and felt something she had not felt in so long she nearly didn't recognize it. She felt cared for, not managed, not tolerated, not included from obligation. Cared for. It came in through some unguarded door she hadn't known was open, and once it came in, she could not put it back out, and she found she had no desire to. Thank you, she said, very quietly. Get some sleep, Elias said. She lay down. The fire worked steadily. By morning, just as she'd predicted, the fever had broken. The cough was lighter. She was sitting up when Elias came back from the horses, red-faced from the cold stomping snow from his boots at the door. He looked at her from across the room. Better, he said. Better, she said. Though I'll want another cup of that sage tea. He took off his coat and went to the stove. She watched him move through her kitchen, through the space she'd organized, and made her own over these months with the particular attentiveness she had for things she was trying to understand fully. Elias, she said. Last night. She paused. What you said. about being asked for, about not being alone. She stopped. He looked up from the kettle. "Yes," he said. She held his eyes across the cabin. "I needed to hear that," she said. "I've needed to hear something like that for a long time." Elias looked at her. This woman wrapped in blankets in his firelight, who had come 800 miles toward a man she didn't know, and made herself indispensable to a mountain she'd never seen, who managed her own difficulties quietly and faced external threats with survey documentation, who brought seeds for a garden that wouldn't be planted for 4 months, because she planned for the future with the absolute conviction of a woman who intended to have one. He said, "You'll hear it as often as you need." The kettle boiled. He made the tea. And outside, the January storm was finally beginning to ease. The storm broke on the 3rd day of February, and with the breaking of it came a quiet between Elias and Margaret that was different from all the other quiets they had learned together. This was the quiet of two people who had stopped pretending. Not about anything dramatic. Not about anything they had named out loud. But somewhere between the January fever and the morning. He'd made sage tea and sat on the floor outside her curtain and refused to go to bed. Something had settled between them like snowpack weight accumulating silently until the shape of the ground beneath it had changed entirely. Elias felt it when he came in from the horses each morning, and she handed him coffee without asking, and it was exactly the temperature he preferred because she had been paying attention. He felt it in the way she'd started leaving his hat on the peg nearest the door, because that's where he always looked for it. He felt it in the conversations after dinner that ran longer than either of them intended, not because they ran out of comfortable silence, but because they kept finding the next thing to say. Margaret felt it when he repaired a loose board in the kitchen shelf without her asking because he'd noticed her testing it that morning. She felt it when he brought her a particular stone from the creek, smooth and white and unusual, and set it on the windowsill without explanation because he'd been out checking the eastern trap line and had seen it and thought she'd find it interesting. She felt it most clearly one afternoon when she was transcribing her herb notes into the small journal she kept, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression so unguarded that he looked away immediately. The way a man looks away from something he wasn't prepared to be caught looking at. She didn't say anything, neither did he. But that evening she sat closer to the fire than usual, and he sat across from her instead of at the far end of the table, and neither of them remarked on the geography. It was the 3rd week of February when Tom Garrett came back up the trail alone, and he was not smiling. Elias heard the horse before Tom reached the cabin, a single rider moving faster than comfort on the icy trail, which meant urgency, and he was outside and waiting. When Tom pulled up his horse blowing hard from the climb. "Tom." Elias looked at his face. "What happened?" Tom pulled off his hat. "It's the Halverson family. Up on the North Ridge, you know the place, the newer homestead, been there 2 seasons. The father's been down with something for 3 weeks. They've got no medicine to speak of. The youngest child, the little girl, she went down 2 days ago with the same thing. Wife came to town this morning nearly frozen through asking if anyone knew of a doctor." Tom looked toward the cabin. "I thought about what Clara said, after she came here back in October." He stopped. "I thought about Margaret." Elias turned and went inside without a word. Margaret was at the kitchen shelf. She turned when he came through the door. She read his face before he opened his mouth. "How far?" she said. "North Ridge. Hour and a half if the trail's passable." She was already moving to the medical tin. "Tell me what Tom said. Symptoms." "He said the father's been down 3 weeks. The youngest child 2 days. Fever for certain, he didn't know what else. 3 weeks is a long time for a simple fever. That's either a bacterial infection that went untreated or a respiratory complication." She opened the tin and began pulling bottles and packets with the focused speed of someone running a practiced inventory. "If the child is 2 days in and following the same pattern as the father, I need to move fast. Children turn faster than adults." "Margaret, I can do this," she said, firmly. Not defensively, just clearly the way she said things that were true. "I know you can. I'm saying the trail north is icy, and I don't want you on a horse alone." She looked at him. "Then you'll come with me," she said. "That's what I was going to say." She almost smiled. Didn't quite. Her hands were already packing the medicine bag she'd assembled over these months. The bag that had grown from the small collection she'd brought from Hartford into something considerably more comprehensive, built from knowledge, from the herb-gathering expeditions, from the careful acquisition of supplies when Elias made his monthly supply run to town. "What about the camphor oil?" he asked. "Already in there. I need the cotton bandaging from the shelf above the window and the bottle of willow bark tincture, the tall brown one on the right side of the tin." He got them. 18 minutes after Tom arrived, they were on horses and moving. The Halverson homestead was smaller than Elias's cabin, and colder, the kind of cold that got into a building when the person managing the fire had been too sick or too exhausted to keep up with it properly. Hannah Halverson met them at the door with the face of a woman who had been running on fear and nothing else for 3 weeks. She was 26, maybe 27, slight and pale, with a toddler on her hip, and the fixed expression of someone past the point of crying. "She's worse since this morning," Hannah said. "The little one. She won't take water." "Where is she?" Margaret asked. "Back room." Margaret went through the door without hesitation, and Elias stood in the main room with Tom and watched the way Hannah Halverson's face changed when someone with knowledge walked through that door, the way a person's body releases a breath they'd been holding so long they'd forgotten they were holding it. From the back room, he could hear Margaret's voice, low and steady and competent, asking questions, asking Hannah to hold the child, explaining in plain language what she was doing and why. Not the voice of someone performing calm. The voice of someone who was calm because they knew what they were doing. It went on for 40 minutes. Then Margaret came back out with her sleeves rolled up and her expression organized in the precise way Elias had learned to read as she is working. Not she is worried. "The child has a respiratory infection," she said. "It's moved into her chest, but it hasn't gone to full pneumonia, not yet. We caught it at the edge of that." She looked at Hannah. "I need you to listen to everything I'm going to tell you, and I need you to do exactly what I say in the order I say it. Can you do that?" Hannah Halverson nodded. "Good." Margaret sat at the table and opened her notebook. "I'm going to write this down as I say it so you have it. First, the fire. The room needs to be warmer than this, specifically her room. I know wood is limited. I don't care. Warmth is the primary treatment right now, and you cannot let it drop overnight. Tell me your wood situation." For the next 30 minutes, Margaret ran a complete assessment of the Halverson homestead, the way she ran everything systematically, practically, without a single wasted word. She prescribed treatments, wrote them out clearly, showed Hannah how to prepare the willow bark tincture for the father, explained the camphor oil application for the child, detailed the warning signs that would mean the situation had passed beyond what she could manage with her current medicines. She left nearly half her medical supplies on the Halverson kitchen shelf. When they were back on the trail heading home, the sun was dropping fast toward the western peaks, and the cold was getting its teeth back. Elias rode beside her for a while without speaking. Then he said, "The child is going to be all right. If Hannah follows the instructions." A pause. "She will. She's a capable woman in a terrible situation. She just needed to know what to do." He rode for another minute. "You knew immediately what to do," he said. "I've been thinking about that family since October," Margaret said. "Tom mentioned them when Clara came up. He said they were isolated and had no medical access. I've been making note of what I'd need if something like this happened." She looked straight ahead at the trail. "I wanted to be ready." Elias turned to look at her. This woman on a horse in the February cold, riding away from a family she had just kept from the edge of catastrophe with medicine. She had been quietly, patiently preparing since her first month on this mountain. "You've been preparing for that family for 4 months," he said. "I've been preparing for whoever might need it," she said. "It happened to be the Halverson family today." "Margaret." She looked at him. I didn't have words immediately. The words were somewhere behind his sternum, where he kept things he hadn't said yet, and they needed a moment to come forward. "What you did in there," he said. "What you are. The way you—" He stopped, tried a different way in. "People in Willow Creek whispered about you the day you stepped off that stage, and this whole time you've been—" He shook his head. "You've been saving their children." She looked at him for a long moment in the February dusk. "I'm not saving anyone," she said quietly. "I'm just doing what I know how to do. What I've always known how to do." A pause, and something in her voice dropped to its most honest register. "I just finally have somewhere to do it." He reached across the gap between the horses. She looked at his hand. Then she took it. They rode the last mile to the cabin like that, his big rough hand around her cold reddened one, not speaking, the mountain going dark around them. The Halverson child's fever broke 5 days later. Hannah came to tell them herself, riding down the north trail with color back in her face, and the toddler bundled behind her on the horse. "She asked for biscuits this morning," Hannah said from outside the cabin door. "First solid food in 4 days." She looked at Margaret with eyes that were wet at the corners. I don't have the words for what you—" "I'm glad she's better," Margaret said. Simply. "Send word if anything changes." Hannah nodded, pressed Margaret's hand between both of hers, and rode back up the north trail. Elias watched her go. "She was going to say thank you," he said. "I know. You cut her off. I didn't need her to say it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I needed the child to be well. That's all I needed." A pause. "Thank yous are nice, but they're not why you do something." He looked at her. "Why do you do it?" he asked. She considered that honestly, the way she considered everything. "Because I can," she said. "And because there aren't enough people who can out here. And because my father did it his entire life and told me it was the closest thing to meaning he'd found. And because—" She stopped. "Because—" he prompted. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "Because for a long time I was told the things I knew didn't matter," she said. "That I wasn't the right kind of person to do the things I could do. That my appearance, my size, my gender made my knowledge less valid than someone else's." Her voice was even, but he could hear the old anger underneath it, quiet and deep and absolutely controlled. "And I decided a long time ago that I would not live as if that were true. Even if I had to do it quietly in places where no one would notice. I would not pretend I was less than I am." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I notice." She blinked. "For what it's worth," he said. "I notice." The 3rd week of February ended. March came. And with March came the accident that changed everything. It started with a routine task, the most dangerous kind. The ones you stop being careful about because you've done them 500 times. Elias was cutting the winter-killed timber on the northeast slope. The dead fall that needed to be cleared before the spring melt made the slope unstable. He'd been doing it all morning. The work had a rhythm: assess the tree, identify the fall line, make the cuts, step back. He'd done it 470 sometimes before by his rough count. This time the tree was rotten higher than he'd assessed. The trunk split wrong, 15 feet up in a direction no one could have fully anticipated from ground level. The upper section came down fast and sideways, and Elias moved. He moved well. He'd been moving quickly in these woods for 12 years, but not quite fast enough. The glancing blow caught his left shoulder and threw him sideways into the slope. He went down hard, his left leg twisting beneath him at an angle he felt in his teeth, and the momentum took him another 10 feet down the slope before the trunk of a standing pine stopped him. He lay still for a moment, took inventory. His left shoulder was wrong. The pain had a specific quality he recognized from old injuries, the deep, nauseating quality of a dislocation. His left leg was, he moved it carefully, testing, not broken, but the knee had bent wrong, and the pain coming from it was serious, the kind that was going to get worse before it got better. He tried to sit up. The world tilted badly. He stopped. I was 700 yards from the cabin on an icy northeast slope with a dislocated shoulder and a seriously damaged knee, and the temperature was 22 degrees. He lay back against the slope and thought about this problem. He could call for Margaret. She would hear him if he was loud enough. She was in the cabin. The wood line was not that far. The mountain carried sound well in winter. He didn't want to call for her, not because of pride. He'd been working on pride since January. Margaret had a particular way of looking at him when he was being proud and stupid that was more effective than any argument, but because he didn't want her on this slope. The slope was icy. She didn't know the terrain the way he did. If she came up fast and went wrong on the ice, he would be helpless to catch her. He tried to stand using only his right arm and his right leg for leverage. His left knee refused weight with a pain that turned his vision white for a moment. He sat back down. He looked at the slope above him. Then he called her name. He didn't call it the way a man calls for help. He called it the way you call for a specific person whose name you know matters. Margaret. The mountain was quiet. Margaret. He heard the cabin door 100 yards below and around the tree line. Heard her come out. Elias. Her voice carried clean and sharp in the cold air. Where are you? Northeast slope. Stay on the main path. Don't come up the direct line, the slope's icy. Follow the path around the big pine cluster to the left. A pause. How bad? He thought about lying, dismissed it. Bad enough I'm not getting down on my own. Silence. Then the sound of movement, quick but controlled, not panicked. He could track her progress by the sounds. The cabin door again. Briefly, then silence. That meant she was getting something. Then footsteps on the path, deliberate and careful. When she came around the pine cluster and saw him, her face did something he felt in his chest. She had the medicine bag over her shoulder, and she was breathing hard from moving fast through the cold. And when she saw him against the slope, her expression went through 3 things in about 2 seconds. Fear, assessment, focus, and then it locked into the third one and stayed there. She came to him carefully on the slope, testing the ground before each step. Don't rush on the ice, he said. I'm not rushing. She was beside him now, kneeling in the snow, her hands already moving, touching his shoulder, his leg, his head checking. Tell me exactly what happened, he told her. The shoulder I can fix, she said immediately. Her voice was completely level. I've reduced dislocations before. Your father taught you. Saw it done once, never done it myself. I've done it 3 times. She was already positioning herself. It hurts. I'll warn you, it hurts considerably. But I need you to relax the shoulder as much as you can manage. If you fight it, it won't go. Can you do that? Elias looked at her. Yes, he said. Look at the sky, she said. Not at me. And breathe out. Keep breathing out all the way while I move. He looked at the sky. He breathed out. The pain was, as she had promised, considerable. And then it was gone, replaced by the deep, almost ridiculous relief of a joint returning to its proper position, a relief so immediate it overrode almost everything else. He heard himself make a sound. There, she said quietly. Her hand was on his shoulder, warm through his coat. Don't try to move it yet. Give it a moment. He lay still. The knee, she said. I need to look at it. I'm going to have to cut the trouser leg. Those are my good trousers. Elias. I know, he said. Go ahead. She had a small knife in the medicine bag. She'd added it months ago without comment for exactly this kind of situation. And she cut the trouser leg carefully and examined his knee with hands that were steady and thorough and gave nothing away. The ligaments, she said. I can feel the swelling already starting. It's a serious sprain, possibly a partial tear. I won't know the full extent until the swelling goes down. She looked at him. You cannot put weight on it. Not today, not tomorrow, probably not for a week. And then only carefully. I have to tend the horses. I'll tend the horses. Margaret, the Northeast Corral needs Elias. She looked directly at him. I'll tend the horses. Tell me what needs doing and I'll do it. You have to stop thinking you're the only person on this mountain who can manage things. He opened his mouth, closed it. You're right, he said. She blinked. Clearly she had prepared for an argument. I know, she said, recovering. The Northeast Corral needs the water trough broken of ice twice daily, he said. The gray horse is favoring his left front check the hoof. There may be a stone or impaction. And the hay in the south shelter is running lower than I'd like the bale. I cut last week is behind the wood box. She was writing in the small notebook she'd taken to keeping in her apron pocket. Anything else, she said. The tack needs one thing at a time, she said. Let's get you down off this slope first. Getting him down the slope took 20 minutes, and the complete cooperative effort of both of them, her supporting his right side, him keeping the damaged leg from bearing weight. Both of them moving with the painstaking care of people who understand that a second fall on this slope would be a serious problem. When they finally got him through the cabin door and onto the bed, Margaret sat down in the chair beside it, with the first indication that any of this had cost her something. She pressed both hands flat on her knees and breathed in slowly once. Just once. Then she straightened up and began properly splinting his knee. "You scared me," she said. It was quiet. She didn't look up from the splint. "I know, I'm sorry." 700 yards up an icy slope. She wrapped the bandaging with precise, practiced movements. "When I heard your voice, I thought—" She stopped. "What did you think?" he asked. She looked up then, and he saw it, all of it, unguarded for one complete second. The fear she had managed and set aside and handled the same way she managed and set aside and handled everything that threatened to destabilize her. "I thought I was going to lose you," she said. The words were simple and plain and not performed at all. Elias reached out with his right hand, the good shoulder, and took her hand where it rested on his knee. She went very still. "I'm here," he said. She looked at their hands. I know, she said. "I know you are." She finished the splint. She made him drink willow bark tea for the pain, which he accepted without complaint, and she helped him arrange himself in the bed to keep the knee elevated, and she brought him both lanterns because it was getting dark, and she was going to the corral, and she didn't want him lying in the dark. "I'll be back in an hour," she said from the door. "The gray horse. Left front hoof possible impaction, I heard you. And the water trough. Twice daily break the ice. I know, Elias, I've been listening to you for 4 months." She went out. He lay in the lantern light and listened to the sounds of the mountain, the wind, the horses distant in the corral, and felt the particular helplessness of a strong man who cannot do the thing he is supposed to do, and felt beneath that helplessness something he had not expected. Safety. He felt safe. How was injured and horizontal and dependent on a woman to do work. He had always done himself, and instead of the panic he might have expected from himself, the thing underneath it all was a steadiness, a knowledge that the mountain was being tended, that the horses would be checked, that the gray's hoof would be examined with the same thorough care Margaret brought to everything. He was not alone. He had not been alone since October. He had just been forgetting to notice it as fully as he should have. She came back in 57 minutes, red-faced from the cold, stamping her boots at the door. "The gray had a small stone impaction," she said before he could ask. "I removed it. He'll need it checked again tomorrow, but he's not limping now. The trough is broken, and the hay is topped off." She came to the stove. "Are you in pain?" "Some." "I'll make more tea." "Margaret." She turned. "Come here," he said. She looked at him for a moment, that careful layered look he knew by now, the one that calculated. She came and stood beside the bed. "Sit down," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed frame. He looked at her wind-burned and tired, her hair entirely escaped from its braid, wearing his old brown coat over her dress because it was warmest and she hadn't bothered to change before going to the corral. "When you came up that slope," he said, "you weren't afraid." "I was afraid," she said immediately. "You didn't show it." "There wasn't any room for it." She looked at her hands. "When someone needs help, fear is it has to wait. You can be afraid after. You set it aside and you do the work." "How long have you known how to do that?" She thought about it honestly. "Since my father was very ill 2 years before he died," she said. "I managed his practice for those 2 years. There were moments—" She stopped. "There were moments when I was the only person in the room, and I had to be the right person in the room, even when I was frightened. You learn. You learn to be the right person in the room," Elias said. "I learned to be the right person, regardless of whether someone else thought I was the right person." She met his eyes. "Those are different things." He held her gaze. "Margaret," he said, "I know I said this before, but I need to say it again because before it was apology and now it's something else." He paused. "I looked at you on that depot road, and I saw everything wrong. Everything that mattered, I missed it entirely. Not just about what you could do, about who you are." He stopped. I have been watching you for 4 months on this mountain. I've watched you with Hannah Halverson's child, and with Roy Ballard, and with a stuck wagon wheel, and a winter fever, and a northeast slope, and a man who didn't know how to receive help. And he stopped. She was completely still. I need you to know, he said, that I see you. Not the version of you the people in Hartford saw, not the version Clara Pendleton saw at the depot. You. He tightened his hand around hers. Here's every part of what you are, I see it. Margaret Whitfield sat on the edge of Elias Carter's bed in the lantern light and looked at this man who had once whispered that she couldn't be his bride and felt something she had no name for, except that it was large and warm and had been waiting for her, she thought, for most of her adult life. She thought about Hartford, about her aunt's careful pity, about the men who had assessed and revised, about the reading society that stopped inviting her, about the agency letter and the formal portrait and the 800-mile stage ride toward a door she'd decided to make open. She looked at Elias. I see you too, she said. His hand tightened on hers. Outside, the mountain wind found the eaves of the cabin and moved through them with the sound it always made. Not quite music, not quite voice, something between the two. They sat in the lantern light. The fire worked, and in the particular silence that exists between two people who have stopped pretending they are strangers, something shifted from becoming into being. It was not a question anymore. Whatever this was between them, it was real. It had been real for a while. They had simply, both in their own ways and for their own reasons, needed enough time to trust that real was something they were allowed to have. The week that followed was its own kind of revelation. Elias was not a patient. Margaret had suspected this and prepared for it, which meant that on the second morning, when he attempted to swing his legs out of the bed and stand up and go check on the gray horse himself, she was already in the room before he'd completed the motion. No, she said. The gray is fine. I checked him an hour ago while you were sleeping. The stone impaction site is healing. He's bearing weight normally. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides. Lie back down. Margaret, I cannot lie in this bed for... The knee needs 3 more days before you can bear partial weight on it. I told you this yesterday. I told you this morning. She moved to the bed and looked at him directly. You are a strong man, Elias. That is not in question. But strong men who put weight on a partially torn ligament too early end up with a permanent injury that limits them for the rest of their lives. A pause. You have 62 acres of mountain to work for the next 30 years. You do not have 62 acres of mountain to work if you cripple that knee in the next 3 days. Do you understand me? He stared at her. Do you understand me? She said again. Yes, he said. Good. Lie back down. He lay back down. She brought him coffee and the newspaper from Pueblo that had been sitting unread since Tom's last visit, and she went back to the kitchen, and he heard her begin the morning work with the easy efficiency that had become the sound of his house being a home. He picked up the newspaper, set it down. Margaret, he called. She appeared in the doorway. Come talk to me, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came and sat in the chair beside the bed, and they talked all morning about the spring planting, about the south-facing slope he'd told her about in October, and how she'd been planning the garden since about the seeds she'd ordered from Hartford, that she was now certain had arrived in town with the last supply shipment, about the gray horse's temperament, and whether it might have something to do with how he'd been handled before Elias acquired him. She talked with her notebook in her lap, consulting it sometimes, making notes in it others, and he watched her think and organize and plan, and felt the strangeness of it, that he had spent 12 years on this mountain absolutely alone, and the aloneness had become so total that he'd stopped experiencing it as a lack. He had not known what was missing. He knew now. The squash seeds, she said at one point, looking at her notebook. I want to try a variety I read about in that altitude gardening text from Hartford. It's shorter season than the standard variety. I'm not certain it'll take up here, but I want to try. Where'd you find an altitude gardening text in Hartford? I wrote to the university library in November. They sent me a monograph. She turned a page. It arrived with the December supply run. He stared at her. You wrote to a university library. I wanted information, Libraries are where information is. She said it as if this were obvious. They were very helpful. You wrote to a university library in November, he said, about altitude gardening in Colorado. I wanted to be ready for spring. She looked up at him, slightly puzzled by his tone. Was that strange? Elias looked at the woman who had arrived in a dusty blue dress with trembling hands and a borrowed dignity, who had packed medicines and seeds, and who had written to a university library in November to be ready for a spring garden on a mountain she'd been living on for 3 weeks. No, he said. That's not strange at all. It was on the 5th day of his recovery, in the late afternoon, when the light went gold through the cabin window, that Margaret sat beside his bed with her herb journal and read aloud from it. The names of plants, their properties, the locations she'd found them, and what season each grew best, and what combinations had proven most effective in the treatments she'd prepared. She wasn't reading it to him particularly. She was working through it, revising some of her notes, and she read aloud because it helped her think, and he was there, and it had simply become natural. And Elias lay on his back and listened to her voice move through the knowledge she carried, this woman who had been told her whole life that what she knew didn't count, reading from the accumulated evidence of how wrong they'd all been, and felt something settle in him so completely that he recognized it as permanent. I was not going to let this woman go. Not because of what she could do. Not because of the medicine, or the garden, or the survey documentation, or the Roy Ballard encounter. Because of the way she'd come up that slope. Because of the way she'd said, "I thought I was going to lose you," and meant it without apology. Because of the way she sat beside his bed and read from her journal, without performing anything, just being what she was completely, and without apology. Because he had spent 12 years on this mountain building a life that was structurally complete and entirely empty, and he had written a letter asking for someone strong enough to survive, and the mountain had sent him something he hadn't known how to ask for. Someone strong enough to save him. Not from the slope, from the silence. He watched her turn a page. "Margaret," he said. Still reading. "When I'm back on my feet," he said. "When the spring comes and the trail opens, I want to take you to Pueblo." She looked up. "What's in Pueblo?" she said. "A proper church, a proper minister." He held her eyes. "We did this backwards. Came to the mountain before the ceremony. I want to do the ceremony. With you." A pause. "If you want that." She was very still. "We're already married by the territory's common law provisions," she said carefully. "Given cohabitation exceeding 6 months. I know that," he said. "I'm not asking about the legal provision. I'm asking about the ceremony, about standing in front of someone and saying the words." He looked at her. "I want to say the words, Margaret, to you, in front of somebody who can write it down." Something moved in her expression, that slow opening of a door she'd been careful about. "Why?" she said, quietly. "Because you came 800 miles, he said. "Because you walked toward me when I was looking for the exit. Because you fixed the shutter gap in the first hour. Because you went up that slope." He paused. "Because you deserve to have the words said properly." Margaret Whitfield closed her herb journal. She looked at this man in the lantern light, the mountain man who had whispered those 4 words at the depot, and who had been taking them back piece by piece every day for 5 months. "Yes," she said. "Simple. Complete." "Yes," she said again. "I want that." The fire worked. The mountain held them. And outside in the early Colorado spring, that was beginning its slow negotiation with the end of winter. The south-facing slope below the cabin was waiting, already warming for the seeds she'd been planting since October. The knee took 11 days to permit full weight. Margaret tracked every one of them. Not obviously, she wasn't the kind of woman who made a patient feel managed. But Elias noticed the way she structured each day of his recovery with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. The morning assessment, the afternoon exercise she allowed, and the afternoon exercise she prohibited, the specific progression from lying still to sitting upright to standing at the door to taking 3 steps and back. She had a system, and she worked it without apology. And by the time she declared him ambulatory enough for light outdoor work, he had improved exactly as she'd said he would. He didn't tell her he'd noticed the system. He suspected she knew anyway. What he did tell her on the morning of the 12th day when he walked from the cabin to the corral and back on his own 2 feet, without the knee giving way, was this: "You were right about 3 days." She looked up from the kitchen shelf where she was grinding dried willow bark. "I'm usually right about 3 days." "You were right about 11 days, too." "I know." She went back to the grinding. Then, without looking up, "Don't push it today. The cold affects the ligaments. They stiffen faster than you'll feel them stiffen. Stop before you think you need to." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She did look up at that. Something in her expression, the careful line of her mouth, shifted toward warmth. "Good," she said. He went out to the corral. The gray horse was waiting for him at the gate, with the particular impatience of an animal who has been tended by someone competent but would prefer the person it knows best. Elias ran his hand down the left front leg, checked the hoof, found clean tissue, and a horse-bearing weight evenly. Margaret had done this every day for 11 days. He stood in the corral and thought about that for a moment. Then he went to check the northeast tree line where the timber work was still unfinished, mapped out the remaining trees by eye, calculated how long it would take him to complete the work once the knee was fully healed. He thought about the spring work schedule, the garden slope, the fence line on the eastern boundary that had lost 2 posts to the winter, heaving the shed roof that needed new shingles before the spring rains. He thought about Pueblo. He'd said the words. She'd said yes. They hadn't spoken of it again in the 11 days of recovery, not directly. There was too much else to manage, but it lived in the space between them, like a lamp burning in a window, steady and warm in there. He went back inside. Margaret was writing in her notebook at the table. She'd taken to working at the table in the mornings when the light was good, and she'd accumulated a second notebook by now, and a third one she used specifically for the medical observations she'd been making over the winter. She wrote the way she did everything, with complete attention, unhurried and thorough. "I want to go to town this week," he said. She looked up. "For supplies." "For that too." He came and sat across from her. "And to speak to the minister about Pueblo." She set her pen down. "The trail's still rough from the melt," she said. "I know. We'll take it slow." She looked at him steadily. "You're sure about this?" "I've been sure since I said it," he said. "Have you changed your mind?" "No." Immediate. No hesitation. "No, I haven't changed my mind." A pause. "I just want to make certain you're not doing it because of gratitude. For the knee. For the slope." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," he said, "I was sure before the slope." She absorbed that. "How long before?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Christmas," he said. "The spiced tea. The pine boughs on the windowsill." Something moved in her face, something private and old, and finally carefully coming into the light. "That was December," she said. "I know when Christmas is." "You waited 3 months." "You had a fever in January. Roy Ballard came in December. The knee was February." He kept his voice even. "It didn't seem like the right time." "And now it does." "Now it does," he said. "Spring's coming. The trail to Pueblo will open. And I have had enough of almost saying the thing and not saying it." He looked directly at her. "I want to say it properly, Margaret. In front of a minister and whatever witnesses are handy. I want it on paper, and I want the words said, and I want to stop treating this like it might be temporary." She was very still. "Is that what you've been doing?" she asked. "Treating it like it might be temporary." "No," he said. "But I'm not sure you have the same confidence about what I'm feeling that I have about it, and I want to remove that uncertainty. Completely." Margaret looked at him across the table. He watched her decide something. "All right," she said. "Town this week. Pueblo when the minister says." "Good." He reached across and touched her hand once, brief and certain. "Good." She picked up her pen. He watched her write for a moment, the easy, confident movements of a woman who had stopped waiting to see if she was allowed to occupy space. Then he went to fix the east fence post that had been leaning since January. Town that week meant Willow Creek on a Thursday, which meant Clara Pendleton's sewing circle was in session, and therefore Clara Pendleton would know within 40 minutes of their wagon arriving that Elias Carter and his wife had come down from the mountain together. Margaret seemed to be aware of this. She came out of the cabin that morning in her second dress, the dark green wool she'd been saving, with her hair arranged properly, and her spine carrying itself the way it always did when she was prepared for something to require composure. Elias looked at her on the wagon bench beside him and said, "You look fine." "I know," she said, which was exactly the right answer. Willow Creek received them differently than October. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a reversal of everything that had come before. It was quieter than that, the way real changes always are, incremental and unannounced and visible, mainly in the small adjustments of people who have been revising their opinions and haven't quite caught up to themselves yet. Tom Garrett saw them from the hardware store doorway and lifted his hand in a greeting that was warmer than it had been in October. The woman at the general store, whose name was Edna, and who had been one of the whispers at the depot, found a reason to speak to Margaret about dried beans and whether she'd been finding what she needed up on the mountain, and her manner was careful but genuine. Hannah Halverson was in town. Margaret spotted her before Elias. Did he felt the shift in Margaret beside him on the wagon bench, the small intake of breath, and then Hannah was coming across the street with the toddler on her hip and a purposeful stride. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I've been hoping to see you." "Hannah." Margaret's voice was warm. "How is the little one?" "She's been well, completely well since the third day after you came." Hannah transferred the toddler to her other hip and reached into her coat pocket. "I wanted to bring you this." She held out a small cloth bundle. "It's not much. Dried berries from last fall and some tea from my mother's recipe. I know it's not equal to what you did, but I wanted you to have something." Margaret took the bundle with both hands. "Thank you," she said. And this time she let it land. She didn't cut it off, didn't minimize. She let Hannah give it, and she received it fully, and Elias watched that happen and felt the quiet significance of it. "Your husband," Hannah said, glancing at Elias. "He brought you up the mountain fast." "He did," Margaret said. "There's been talk," Hannah said carefully. "About what you did. People are talking about it." "What kind of talk?" Margaret asked. "The good kind." Hannah looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Pendleton told the sewing circle about the herb bundles and the survey documents and Roy Ballard, and I told them about my daughter." She paused. "I think people are understanding that they misjudged things in October." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "People generally come around," she said finally, "when they have enough information. Some of them were wrong to say what they said at the depot," Hannah said. "I was one of them. I didn't say anything out loud, but I thought it, and I'm not proud of that." Elias watched Margaret receive this. She could have been gracious about it in the easy way, could have said, "Oh, it's fine. It doesn't matter, water under the bridge." She didn't do that. "It's behind us," she said. "How's your husband healing?" Hannah blinked at the redirect. Then she accepted it. "He's better. The tincture worked just as you said it would. He's back on his feet." "Good." Margaret handed the notebook to Elias without looking at him. He'd learned by now to take things she handed him without making it a moment, and pulled out the small pencil she kept with it. "I'm going to write you down a list of the most important medicines to keep in your stores for winter. Things you can get from the general store, and things you can gather from the land. Some of it Hannah will already have, some of it you'll need to look for in summer." She wrote for 3 minutes, while Hannah watched her with the expression of someone who has revised an opinion and is not entirely finished with the revision. Then she tore the page out neatly and handed it over. "If anything comes up," Margaret said, "you can send word up the trail, or I'll be in town on the first Thursday of each month." Elias looked at her. She had not told him that. She caught his look and gave him a small one back that said, "We'll discuss it later." "The sewing circle is first Thursday," Hannah said. "I know," Margaret said. Hannah absorbed this. "Clara will be surprised." "Clara Pendleton is a woman who manages this town effectively and cares whether people in it are all right," Margaret said evenly. "She assessed me wrong in October. I don't hold it against her. I'd rather work with her than maintain a grievance." She looked at Hannah directly. "I intend to be here a long time." Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real one, the kind that had something new in it. "I think this mountain suits you," she said. I think so too, Margaret said. At the general store. Elias spoke to the postmaster, who doubled as the town's primary communication link to Pueblo, and arranged to get word to the minister there about the timing of a ceremony. The postmaster, a thin man named Briggs, who had the excellent frontier quality of performing his function without excess curiosity, said he could have an answer back within a week. Margaret, meanwhile, was in the store with Edna and a list. Elias leaned against the counter and watched her work through the list with the focused efficiency she brought to acquisition, knowing exactly what she needed, not being talked into things she didn't, but also not being short with Edna about it. She asked Edna's opinion on two things genuinely and accepted Edna's knowledge about local supply patterns with the ease of a woman who understands that other people know things she doesn't, and there is nothing shameful about acknowledging it. By the time they were loading the wagon, 3 separate people had spoken to Margaret, 2 of them women who had been at the depot in October, and who were now finding the particular awkward language of revised opinion. She handled all of them the same way, direct, warm, without either resentment or performance. Meeting them where they were. Not making it easier for them than it needed to be, but not making it harder either. In the wagon heading back up the mountain trail. Elias said, "First Thursday. I decided this morning," she said. When Hannah told me people were talking." She looked at the trail ahead. "I can't help people up on the mountain who won't come to me. If I'm in town once a month, they know where to find me. They can ask questions. They can bring me problems before the problems become crises. And Clara Pendleton's Sewing Circle is the best network in 3 counties for making sure people know where to find you." "It is," she said. "Clara Pendleton is a woman who knows every family's situation between here and the North Ridge. If she tells people I can help with medical matters, they'll believe her." A pause. "Clara Pendleton's endorsement is more useful to me than my feelings about what she said at the depot." Elias looked at her sideways. "That's a very practical approach." "Yes," she said. "It is." A brief pause. "I am sometimes a very practical woman. I've noticed." She looked at him. Something in her expression that almost smile, she managed sometimes the one that still felt like a gift, because it was real. "Good," she said. The answer from the Pueblo minister arrived in 6 days. He could perform the ceremony on the first Saturday of April if they could make the journey. He had 2 witnesses available from his congregation. He asked only for their names and that they arrive before noon. Elias read the letter at this kitchen table with Margaret standing beside him. She read it over his shoulder, and when she'd finished, she straightened up and went back to what she'd been doing at the stove. He watched her back. "Well," he said. "Well, what?" she said. "We go on the first Saturday of April. You're not going to say anything else about it." She turned around. She was holding a wooden spoon, and her hair was escaping its braid, the way it did when she'd been working at the stove for a while, and she looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "What do you want me to say?" she said. "Something," he said. "It's something. The ceremony." "It is something," she agreed. "It's a very important something." She looked at him steadily. "I've wanted it since January. I've wanted it since the first storm when we sat at the table for 2 hours and talked about things I've never told anyone." A pause. "I've been waiting for you to say the words, 'since Christmas, Elias.' I'm not going to act surprised that we're doing this." He stared at her. "Since Christmas," he said. "Since the Christmas spice tea," she said. "Yes." "You knew." "I thought I knew. There's a difference. I didn't want to assume." She turned back to the stove. "But yes, I knew." Elias sat at the table for a moment, processing the information that Margaret Whitfield had known since December, had waited for him to find the words, and had not pushed, had not maneuvered, had not done anything except be exactly what she was, and let him come to it at his own speed. "You could have said something," he said. "You needed to arrive at it yourself," she said. "It wouldn't have meant the same thing if I'd had to lead you to it." "You think that?" "I know that." She didn't turn around. "You are a man who was alone for 12 years and learned to not need anything and then had to unlearn that piece by piece. I was not going to rush that process." A pause. "I know what it costs to trust something you're not sure you're allowed to have. I was not going to push. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up from the table, crossed the kitchen, and when she turned, because she heard him moving, he was right there close, and he took her face in his hands, the way a man touches something he is no longer afraid of losing, because he has decided not to let it go. And he kissed her. Not tentatively. Not with the careful management they'd both been practicing for months. Completely. She made a small sound surprise, and then not surprise recognition arrival. And then she kissed him back with the same completeness, and the wooden spoon was somewhere on the floor, and neither of them noticed. When he finally pulled back, her eyes were bright. She looked at him for a moment. "You have terrible timing," she said. "The soup is going to burn." "Let it burn," he said. "It won't burn," she said, and stepped back and rescued the soup efficiently. But she was smiling, really smiling, the unguarded kind. The kind he'd been waiting to see, and hadn't fully seen until now, and the kitchen felt like the center of the world. They rode to Pueblo on the first Saturday of April on 2 horses, the trail finally cooperative after the worst of the spring melt had passed. Margaret wore the dark green wool dress she'd worn to town in March, with her hair arranged properly, and a small brooch at her collar that had been her mother's. She'd mentioned it once briefly a long time ago, and Elias had not known she'd brought it from Hartford until she appeared in it that morning. High were his good coat and a shirt he'd ordered from the general store in March without telling her why and when. He came out of the sleeping room, she looked at him and said, "You got a new shirt?" "I did," he said. "When?" "March." She absorbed that. "Planning ahead," she said. "I've been learning from someone," he said. The ride to Pueblo took 3 hours, and they talked most of it. Not about the ceremony, not about what came after, but about the spring planting, and the south-facing slope, and the seeds that had arrived with the March supply run, and whether the shorter season squash variety was going to take in the first year or need a second season to establish. It was the best kind of conversation. The kind that assumes a future and moves around inside it comfortably. The minister's name was Reverend Aldous Marsh, a solid practical man in his 60s who married frontier couples with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had done it hundreds of times and understood that the paperwork was not the point. He looked at them both when they came into his small church, and he looked at them the way a man looks who has been watching people his whole life and knows the shape of what he's seeing. "You've been married a while," he said. It was not quite a question. "Since October," Elias said. "Common law." "6 months," Reverend Marsh said. He looked at Margaret. "And you want the ceremony now?" "We want to say the words," Margaret said. "Properly." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Words matter." He turned to get his Bible. "Let's begin." The 2 witnesses were an older couple, the Hendersons, who had the comfortable manner of people who attend ceremonies regularly and know their role. They stood beside Elias and Margaret in the small church with the April light coming through the east window, and Reverend Marsh opened his Bible and began. Elias had been to weddings. He knew the shape of the ceremony, the words that would be said, the responses that were expected. But knowing the shape of a thing and standing inside it are different. When Reverend Marsh asked if he took this woman, and he looked at Margaret, at her face in the April light, at the brooch that had been her mother's, and the dark green dress, and the direct brown eyes that had looked at him from the beginning, with the clear, honest attention of someone who had decided to see him fully, the words he said were not the rote repetition of a formula. They were something he meant in every room of himself. "I do," he said. And when Margaret said it, "I do," in the clear, steady voice that never performed anything that said what it meant, because she had long ago decided that honesty was the only language worth speaking, he felt it land somewhere permanent. Reverend Marsh pronounced them married. He signed the paper. They signed the paper. The Hendersons signed as witnesses, and Mrs. Henderson shook Margaret's hand with genuine warmth and said, "I hope the mountain treats you well." And Margaret said, "It already has," with a certainty that made the older woman smile. On the right, the afternoon was clear, and the trail was good, and the mountains caught the light, the way they did in April, with the particular brilliance of a world waking up. Margaret rode beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Then she said, "It's different." "What is?" he said. "How it feels. I thought it would feel the same. We've been living it for 6 months. But it feels different." She considered this. Like something that was slightly unsteady has been set down properly. He understood that exactly. Yes, he said. She rode for another minute. Then she said, I want to tell Tom Garrett. He looked at her. Tom specifically. Tom was kind, she said simply. He came up the mountain to tell us about Hannah's daughter. He felt bad about what happened at the depot, I could tell. He deserves to hear that it came out all right. Elias thought about Tom Garrett and his guilty expression on the day he'd arrived with Clara Pendleton, and the way he'd looked at his horses instead of at Elias when certain things were being said. We can stop at the store on the way through, he said. They did. Tom Garrett heard the news with a visible, uncomplicated joy that made Margaret laugh. Actually laugh, surprised out of her by the genuineness of it. And he shook Elias's hand with both of his and told Margaret she was the best thing to happen to that mountain in 20 years, and then immediately looked embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. Sorry, he said. I don't sorry. Don't apologize for that, Margaret said warmly. I'll take it. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is glad something has worked out in the world. You should come to the Harvest Social, he said. In September, the whole county comes. It would be good to have you there. Elias looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Tom. We'll be there, she said, riding the last mile to the cabin in the late afternoon. Elias thought about September. The Harvest Social. The whole county. Margaret in the green wool dress, or perhaps something new by then. Something she'd made or ordered. Walking into a room full of people who had whispered at the depot. Walking in with him. He thought about Clara Pendleton seeing that. He thought about what Clara Pendleton would say to the sewing circle afterward. He thought about Tom Garrett's uncomplicated joy. You're thinking loudly, Margaret said beside him. September, he said. The Harvest Social. I know. You said yes immediately. I meant it immediately. She looked at the trail ahead. I told you in October I intended to be there a long time. A long time includes September. Clara Pendleton will be there. I know. A pause. I'm going to ask her to teach me to make a proper frontier quilt. I saw one at her house in October when we visited. It was beautiful work, and she knows it, and she'll appreciate being asked. Another pause. Clara Pendleton responds well to being recognized as competent. Most people do. He stared at her. You've been planning this since October. I've been thinking about it since October, she said. Planning implies I had dates and specifics. I had a general direction. The general direction being, make myself genuinely useful, she said. Earn the respect of the people who can offer it, and not worry about the people who won't. Build something here. She looked at him. Here, with you, on this mountain. A pause. That was always the direction. The cabin came around the last bend in the trail. Elias looked at it, the log walls, the solid chimney, the woodpile, the corral where the gray horse was visible near the gate, and felt something he could only describe as completion. Not perfection, not the absence of difficulty, but completion, the sense of a thing having arrived at its right shape. They unsaddled the horses together, working the familiar routine they'd established over months, each knowing their part without discussion. When they went inside, the cabin was cold from the day's absence, and he built up the fire while she changed from the green dress and started the evening meal. He watched her move through the kitchen. He thought about the Reverend. You've been married a while, 6 months on this mountain, and the man had seen it in 30 seconds. Because it was visible. Because the shape of two people who have learned each other shows in how they move through shared space. The small adjustments, the practiced ease, the absence of the careful performance that new people do around each other. They were not new people. They were a long way from new people. Margaret, he said. She looked up from the stove. I want to tell you something, he said. All right, she said. When I wrote that letter, he said, to the agency, I wrote that I needed someone strong enough to survive. She waited. I didn't know what I was asking for, he said. I thought I did. I thought I could picture what that looked like. A woman who could chop wood and carry water and face a winter without complaint. He stopped. I was asking for a capable person. A practical arrangement. I know, she said, gently. What you are, he said, is nothing like what I asked for. He looked at her directly. You are so far past what I asked for that it embarrasses me to remember what I thought I needed. He stopped. You are not a practical arrangement. You are the person I didn't know how to ask for because I didn't believe that person was a thing I was allowed to want. Margaret set down what she was holding. She crossed the kitchen. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him with those brown eyes that had been looking at him straight since the first moment on the depot road, through everything, through all of it. You are the only person, she said, in my entire life who looked at me and kept looking. Who kept looking past the first thing they saw and went on looking. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was working for something. My father did. And you. She paused. That's it. That's the whole list. He put his arms around her. She leaned into him, this large, capable, brilliant woman who carried medicines and survey documents and university library correspondence and seeds for a garden. She'd been planning since October, leaned into him with the particular weight of a person who has stopped bracing for the moment it goes wrong. She trusted this. She trusted him. He held her in the firelight of the cabin that was now theirs, that had become theirs so gradually and so completely, that there was no single moment he could point to and say, there that was when, and felt the mountains settle around them both, like something that had been waiting to do exactly this. Outside, the April evening was cold and clear. Inside, the fire was working, and on the south-facing slope below the cabin in the soil that was just beginning to warm after the long winter, the seeds Margaret had ordered from Hartford in July, planted 2 weeks ago with the care and precision of a woman who planned for futures she intended to live in, were in the ground. Waiting. The way she had waited. With absolute confidence that spring would come. The seeds came up in May. Margaret was the one who found the first green shoot pushing through the dark soil of the south-facing slope on a Tuesday morning when Elias was working the eastern fence line. She didn't call out to him. She knelt down in the dirt in her work dress and looked at it for a long moment. This small definitive proof that what she had planned in Hartford in July, ordered in November, carried 800 miles in a traveling bag, and pressed into cold Colorado ground in April, had decided to become real. Then she stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went to find him. He heard her coming up slope before he saw her. He knew her footsteps by now, the particular rhythm of them purposeful and unhurried. He turned. Her face told him before she said a word. The beans, she said. He left the fence post where it was and followed her down. They stood together on the south-facing slope and looked at the small green shoot pushing up through the dark soil. And Elias looked at it and then looked at her, at the expression on her face, which was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter and more complete than either. There'll be more by Thursday, she said. Probably. He agreed. She crouched down and touched the soil beside the chute, not the chute itself, just the soil near it, careful. My father would have liked this, she said. He always kept a kitchen garden, even in Hartford, even with the short season. He said there was something about watching a thing you planted become food that nothing else quite replicated. How is right, Elias said. She stood up. She looked at the slope at the rows she'd laid out with the careful geometry of someone who had read about altitude gardening, and then applied it with her own particular thoroughness, and something in her expression was so fully at peace that he felt it from where he stood. I'm going to need more seeds next year, she said. I want to try the onion variety, and possibly a hardier tomato if I can find one adapted to altitude. He almost smiled. It's May. Planning season, she said simply. He did smile then. She caught it. What, she said. Nothing, he said. You're already planning next year's garden. Someone has to, she said, and walked back toward the cabin, and he followed her, and behind them, the south-facing slope held its green shoots up toward the Colorado morning like small declarations. The harvest social in September was as Tom Garrett had promised the whole county. Margaret had been to Clara Pendleton's sewing circle every first Thursday since April. She had learned the names of every family between Willow Creek and the North Ridge, and a reasonable amount about each one's particular circumstances. She had treated 4 cases of minor injury or illness through the summer: a broken finger, a persistent cough that needed attention before it went further, a child's infected insect bite, a burn from a cooking accident that would have scarred badly without proper treatment. She had asked Clara Pendleton to teach her the frontier quilting technique in May, and Clara had said yes with the expression of a woman who appreciated being recognized as competent and was trying not to show how much. And by September, Margaret had completed a quilt of her own that Clara had inspected with genuine critical attention and called good work. Not excellent. Good. From Clara Pendleton, that was the same thing. Margaret understood this and accepted it accordingly. What she had not anticipated was September itself. The harvest social was held in the large barn at the edge of town, and the whole county meant exactly that. Families from every ridge and valley, within a day's ride, people she'd heard about from Clara's thorough social intelligence, but hadn't yet met, children running between the legs of adults who stood in clusters and talked about the summer's work and the coming winter, and the small, significant events of frontier lives. She and Elias arrived on the wagon in the late afternoon. He helped her down from the bench. She straightened her dress, the dark green wool again, because it was the best she had, though she'd let it out slightly at the waist over the summer, and added a small trim of ribbon at the cuffs that Clara had recommended, and that she privately thought was an improvement. And she looked at the barn and the crowd and felt something she recognized. The old thing. The thing that lived in the stomach. The voice that said, "You do not belong in rooms like this. You will be looked at. You know what happens when you are looked at." She had been managing that voice since she was 12 years old. "All right," Elias said beside her. "Yes," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked into the harvest social together, and what happened was not what the old voice had predicted. What happened was something she would carry for the rest of her life, as the specific moment when the story she had been told about herself. The one about being too much and not enough, simultaneously about occupying space incorrectly, about being tolerated rather than wanted, finally completely and irrevocably stopped being the loudest story in the room. Hannah Halverson saw them first. She crossed the barn with the directness of a woman who has decided something and is acting on it, and she brought her husband, a tall, quiet man named Gunnar, who shook Elias's hand and then turned to Margaret with an expression of simple, complete sincerity. "My daughter is well because of you," he said. "That's a debt I can't repay, but I want you to know I know it." Margaret looked at him. "Take care of your family," she said. "That's all I ask." He nodded. That was enough. Then Clara Pendleton arrived. Clara moved through crowds the way she moved through everything, with the authority of a woman who had decided the shape of a room before she entered it. She looked at Margaret with those sharp eyes, and Margaret looked back with the direct, steady gaze she'd been deploying against Clara Pendleton's social machinery since October. "The quilt," Clara said. "I showed it to Edna Morrison. She wants to know who taught you the binding technique." "You did?" Margaret said. Clara's chin came up slightly. "I know that. I'm telling you that Edna Morrison noticed." A pause. "Edna Morrison has the most critical eye in 3 counties for needlework." "Then I'm glad she noticed," Margaret said. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "There's a woman here tonight, Eleanor Vance from the South Valley, been here 2 seasons. Her husband's been difficult. She's been managing alone in ways she probably shouldn't have to." A pause. "She mentioned she's been having headaches that won't resolve. I thought you might want to speak to her." Margaret held Clara Pendleton's gaze. This was not an accident. Clara Pendleton had found a woman who needed medical attention and was directing her toward Margaret Carter with the efficiency of a woman who had spent months deciding that Margaret Carter was a resource this county needed and had now fully committed to the position. "Point me to her," Margaret said. Clara did. Elias watched Margaret cross the barn toward the South Valley woman, watched the way the crowd adjusted around her, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but in the small organic way that crowds adjust around someone who belongs, and felt something so specific and clean that it took him a moment to name it. Pride. Not possessive pride. Not the pride of ownership. The pride of witness. The pride of a person who has been in the room when something real happens and knows they are looking at the true shape of a thing. Tom Garrett appeared at his elbow. "She's something," Tom said. Not with the complicated hedging of a man managing his words carefully, just plainly. "She is," Elias said. "I heard about Eleanor Vance," Tom said. "Clara's been steering people to Margaret all summer," discreetly. "Clara doesn't like to be seen steering. She likes people to think they arrived at things themselves." He paused. "But she's been doing it." Elias looked at Tom. "Clara Pendleton has been managing Margaret's medical reputation. Clara Pendleton has decided that Margaret Carter is good for this county," Tom said. Which in practical terms means the same thing. He picked up 2 cups from the refreshment table and handed one to Elias. "How's the knee?" "Fully healed." "And the shoulder?" "Winter stiffness in the cold. Otherwise fine." Tom nodded. "She know what she's doing, your wife?" "Yes," Elias said. "She does." He watched Margaret with Eleanor Vance across the barn, watched the way Eleanor's posture changed within 5 minutes of the conversation. The visible release of a woman who has been holding something alone and has finally found somewhere to put it. He watched that happen. And he thought about October, about the depot road and the stagecoach and the 30 witnesses and the words he'd said that he'd been taking back piece by piece for a year. He thought about how close he'd come to looking for the exit. He thought about what the mountain would have been without her. The quiet, the working days and the empty evenings, and the fire with no one across from it. He thought about that version of the winter, just past the storms, without the evening conversations. January's deep cold without the sage tea and the camphor oil. And someone who had said, "I thought I was going to lose you," and meant it without apology. He thought about the south-facing slope with no seeds in it. He could not fully picture it anymore. Not because it was so long ago, but because she had become so thoroughly part of the shape of that mountain that the version without her had stopped being imaginable. Margaret came back across the barn 20 minutes later with her notebook in her hand and the focused expression of someone who has assessed a situation and knows what it requires. "Eleanor Vance has been managing a chronic headache condition for 4 months without treatment," she said without preamble. "It's tension-based, not neurological. I'm fairly confident of that, but it's been affecting her sleep and her ability to function. I'm going to send her home with willow bark tincture and a specific set of instructions about what to look for if it changes character." She opened the notebook. "I also want to visit the South Valley in October. I'd like to see the homestead and meet the husband." "You want to assess the husband," Elias said. She looked up at him. "I want to make sure Eleanor Vance has what she needs," she said carefully. "All of what she needs." He understood what she wasn't saying. "I'll ride with you," he said. She looked at him for a moment, that look that calculated and then settled. "Good," she said. They stayed at the harvest social until the evening was well along. Margaret talked to more people than he could track. She moved through the room with an ease that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had stood on the depot road a year ago. Not because she was performing ease, but because she had stopped bracing. She had stopped waiting for the room to decide against her. She belonged here. She knew it. The room knew it. At one point, late in the evening, Elias found himself standing with Reverend Marsh, who had come up from Pueblo for the social, as he apparently did each year. And the Reverend looked across the room at Margaret, who was in conversation with 3 women, one of whom was laughing at something she'd said. "April seems to have suited her," Reverend Marsh said. "Before April too," Elias said. The Reverend looked at him. "You know what I saw when you 2 walked into my church?" he said. "What?" "I saw 2 people who had already done the hard work," he said. "The ceremony is easy. Anyone can stand in front of a minister and say words. The hard work is what happens before and after. Learning a person. Deciding they're worth the learning. Deciding you are." He paused. "You'd both done that. I could see it." Elias was quiet for a moment. "She did most of it," he said. "She did her half," Reverend Marsh said. "You did yours. That's how it works." They watched Margaret across the room. She said something else, and the 3 women laughed again, and one of them, a woman. Elias didn't know from a family he hadn't met, reached out and touched Margaret's arm with the easy warmth of someone who has decided a person is a friend. not a stranger they were being gracious to. A friend. Reverend Marsh said, "You going to stand here all night watching her or go be with her?" Elias set down his cup. He crossed the barn. Margaret saw him coming from 10 feet away and turned to include him in the circle without breaking the conversation. The natural, practiced ease of a woman who has incorporated someone into the fabric of her life so completely that his arrival is just continuation. He stood beside her. She shifted half a step toward him without looking, the small unconscious adjustment of someone who knows exactly where the person they trust most is in a room. The conversation continued around them, and Elias Carter stood in the Harvest Social in Willow Creek, Colorado, in September of 1885, beside his wife, and felt the mountain in him, the 12 years of silence and solitude, and the life he'd built that was structurally complete and entirely empty, settle into its final rearrangement. Not gone. He was still a mountain man. He would always be a mountain man. But the mountain had a different shape now. It had her in it. On the ride home. The night was clear and cold, with the first real edge of autumn in it, and they rode side by side the way they always did, close enough to talk. Margaret was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Eleanor Vance's husband." "Yes," Elias said. "He's the kind of man who makes a woman feel small on purpose," she said. "I could tell from the way Eleanor talked about him. The small pauses. The things she didn't say." "I thought that might be it," he said. "I'm going to go back every month," she said. "Not just October. Every month until I'm certain she has what she needs." A pause. "And I'm going to make sure she knows she can send word up the mountain any time." "All right," he said. "You don't object." "Why would I object?" She was quiet for a moment. "Some men would," she said. "Some men would consider it excessive involvement in another family's situation. I'm not some men," Elias said. "And you're not some woman." He looked at her in the dark. "If Eleanor Vance needs help, we help Eleanor Vance. That's not complicated." Margaret looked at him. "We," she said. "We," he said. She rode for a moment. Then she said, "I love you." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, plainly, without performance directly. Elias felt it land in the permanent place where he kept things she'd said that he intended to carry forever. "I love you," he said. Not tentatively. Not as a response. As its own statement. As something that was true independent of anything else, and had been true for longer than he'd had the words for it. She nodded once. As if they had confirmed something they had both known, and were now simply making it official. The cabin came around the last bend. Elias looked at it. The log walls, the straight chimney, the woodpile against the north wall already growing for the coming winter. Because he had started cutting in August, and Margaret had told him where the deadfall was on the northeast slope, because she had mapped it on one of her walks and written it in her notebook. He looked at the south-facing slope, invisible in the dark. But present the slope where the beans had come up in May, and the squash in June, and where the shorter season variety had, as she had hoped, and not quite let herself expect, produced a harvest in August that she had written about to the University Library in Hartford to report the results of her experiment. She had written to the University Library to report her results. He had found the letter on the table and read the address and looked at her, and she had said, "I thought they'd want to know if it worked," and he had felt something so large it had no name. They unsaddled the horses in the familiar dark, working the routine that was so practiced now it required no discussion, each knowing their part. Inside, he built up the fire. She made tea, not the sage tea, just the regular evening tea, the ritual that had been the last hour of every day since November. They sat at the table. The fire worked. The mountain held them. Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at him across the table. Looked at him, the way she had been looking at him since the depot road, with the full direct attention of a woman who had decided to see him completely and had never once looked away. "Next year," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to expand the garden to the lower section of the slope," she said. "The soil there is different, heavier clay, but if we work compost into it through the winter, it should be productive by spring. Also," she opened her notebook, "I want to try winter wheat in the small field east of the corral. Tom Garrett says 2 families have had success with it at this altitude." Tom's been talking about winter wheat since July, Elias said. I've been thinking about it too. She looked up. You have? Winter wheat means a grain harvest, he said. If it takes, we could supply Tom's store. Reduce what we have to bring up from Pueblo. She was looking at him with an expression he knew, the one that meant something had aligned, some plan she'd been carrying had found its missing piece. I didn't know you'd been thinking about it, she said. I've been planning, he said. She smiled. The real one. The unguarded one. Good, she said. He looked at her across the table. This woman in his firelight, with her notebook and her tea and her direct brown eyes, and a year of this mountain in her face, the particular quality that comes from a year of hard work and hard weather, and a life that has required everything and given back more. And he thought about Reverend Marsh's words. The hard work is what happens before and after. I thought about the before: the depot road, the stuck wagon wheel, the shutter gap, the first storm, the January fever, the northeast slope, the Halverson child, Roy Ballard Christmas, the ceremony in April. He thought about all of it, and he let it settle into its right place behind them, part of the ground. They stood on the foundation of the thing they were still building. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, the Colorado autumn was beginning its work, the slow, gorgeous, merciless process of getting the mountain ready for winter, the way it had done every year for 1,000 years before either of them arrived, and would do for 1,000 years after. But inside the cabin, their cabin, hers, as much as his, in every way that mattered more than his. In some, the fire worked, and the tea steamed, and the notebook lay open on the table with next year's plans in it, written in the precise, thorough hand of a woman who had come 800 miles toward a door she intended to open, and had opened it, had walked through it, had made it home. The mountain man, who had once whispered that she couldn't be his bride, looked at his wife across the firelight and understood fully and finally what he had almost let walk back onto that stage. Not a practical arrangement, not a capable partner, not someone strong enough to survive, someone strong enough to save him from the silence, from the smallness of a life lived only for its own maintenance, from the man he had been quietly becoming in 12 years of not being truly known by anyone. She had arrived with medicines and seeds, and a university library correspondence, and a brooch that had been her mother's, and she had looked at a mountain that did not care what anyone brought to it, and she had said, I will learn you, and she had meant it, and she had done it. And the mountain, this mountain, their mountain, had given her back everything she brought, and then given her more. Margaret Carter looked up from her notebook and caught him watching her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, those direct brown eyes clear and certain, and completely fully home. All right, she said, and looked back at her notebook and wrote down one more thing for next year. And the fire worked, and the mountain held, and in the cabin on the Colorado high country that had become the place where both of them finally, permanently, irrevocably belonged. The silence was not empty. It never would be again.